Hello everyone and welcome back to the Horror Hut. Now, I know a lot of you use these videos to sleep, so before you drift off I thought it would be a fun idea if everyone can leave a comment and let me know where you are listening from in the world. Also like and subscribe if you are enjoying the episodes. Right, let's get comfy and relax and let's begin. I've always been a night jogger. It's the only time I can clear my head after a long day. There's something about the quiet streets, the sound of my shoes hitting the pavement, and the way the world feels like it belongs to just me for a little while. I've been running the same route for years without any issues. It's well lit, takes me through a few residential blocks, past a park, and then loops back to my apartment. About a month ago, I first noticed him. I wouldn't have thought anything of it at first because there are always other people out walking dogs, jogging, or just heading home. But this man wasn't jogging, and he didn't have a dog. He was walking, slowly, on the opposite side of the street. It was late, maybe around 11 p.m. He was wearing a dark jacket and jeans, nothing unusual. But something about the way he walked felt deliberate. His head was down, and he didn't look around. He wasn't looking at his phone or anything like that. I didn't think much of it until I passed him again on my way back. He was still walking, heading in the same direction as before, but he barely made any progress. It was like he'd been waiting. I brushed it off. There are plenty of reasons someone might be out late at night. Maybe he was coming home from work or just taking a walk. But the next night, he was there again. This time, I saw him near the park. Same clothes, same slow walk. He was on the sidewalk closest to the trees, and when I ran past, I felt his eyes on me. I didn't look directly at him, but I could feel it, that prickling sensation on the back of my neck. I told myself I was imagining it. People are allowed to be out at night. It's not against the law. But then it happened again. And again. Every night for the next week, he was there. Always in a different spot along my route, like he knew exactly where I'd be. One night, he was standing by a streetlight, just staring at the ground as I ran past. Another night, he was sitting on a bench in the park. The way he was always in a new spot made it impossible for me to ignore. He wasn't just out for a walk. He was following me. I started to change my route, hoping to avoid him. The first time I did, I went a completely different way, taking a longer path that avoided the park altogether. I thought I'd outsmarted him, but when I was heading back toward my apartment, there he was. This time, he was leaning against a lamppost, his hands shoved into his jacket pockets. He didn't move or say anything, but I knew he'd seen me. I felt my chest tighten. I jogged past him, trying to keep my pace steady, but as soon as I turned the corner, I broke into a sprint. When I got home, I locked the door and stood there for a while, trying to catch my breath. My heart was pounding, not from the run, but from the fear. I told myself I was being paranoid, that it was just a coincidence. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The next few nights, I didn't go out. I stayed inside, pacing my apartment and staring out the window. I felt trapped. Jogging was my escape, and now it felt like even that had been taken from me. On the fourth night, I convinced myself to go out again. I told myself I couldn't let fear control me. I took another new route, this one even farther from my usual path. For a while, it felt good. The streets were quiet, and I started to feel like maybe I'd been overreacting. But then, as I turned onto a dimly lit street, I saw him. He was standing under a broken streetlight, his face partially obscured by shadows. I froze for a moment, my body stiff with fear. He didn't move, didn't call out to me. He just stood there, staring. I turned around and started running in the opposite direction. I didn't care how it looked or if he thought I was scared. I was scared. My legs felt like they were moving on their own, my breathing ragged. I didn't stop until I was back in my apartment, the door locked and bolted behind me. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, shadowed and still. The next morning, I called the non-emergency police line and explained what had been happening. They told me there wasn't much they could do unless the man had directly threatened me. They suggested I change my routine and stay in well-lit areas. The problem was, I'd already done that, and it hadn't helped. I started carrying pepper spray and a small alarm on my runs. I thought about stopping altogether, but the idea of letting him win made me angry. I wasn't going to let some stranger take away the one thing that kept me sane. So, I kept running, but I was always on edge, always looking over my shoulder. Then, one night, everything came to a head. I was on my usual route, my headphones in but the volume low so I could hear if anyone was behind me. I just passed the park when I felt it, that unmistakable sensation of being watched. I glanced over my shoulder and saw him. He was closer this time, maybe 50 feet behind me, walking quickly. My heart was racing. I picked up my pace, trying to put some distance between us, but when I glanced back again, he was even closer. He wasn't walking anymore. He was jogging, his eyes locked on me. Panic set in. I took off running, my legs burning as I pushed myself as hard as I could. I could hear his footsteps behind me, heavy and fast. I darted down a side street, hoping to lose him, but he was still there, his footsteps growing louder. I turned another corner and saw a convenience store up ahead. The lights were on, and there were people inside. I sprinted toward it, my lungs screaming for air. When I burst through the door, the clerk looked up in surprise. "Someone's following me," I gasped, barely able to get the words out. The clerk came around the counter, looking toward the door. I turned to look too, but the man was gone. I don't know where he went or how he disappeared so quickly, but he wasn't there anymore. The clerk called the police, and they came to take a statement. They told me they'd patrol the area, but I never saw the man again after that night. I don't know who he was or what he wanted, but I still think about him every time I go for a run. I still feel his eyes on me, even when I know he's not there. The laundry room in my apartment building was in the basement, down a narrow flight of concrete stairs that always smelled faintly damp. It wasn't a great setup, but the machines were cheap, and I was broke, so I used them anyway. Most of the time, it was quiet down there. People usually did their laundry during the day, so I would wait until late at night when the washers were empty, and I could take my time. That night, it was almost midnight when I grabbed my laundry basket and headed down. The hallway leading to the stairs was dimly lit, one of the bulbs flickering like it always did. I balanced the basket on my hip as I pushed open the heavy basement door and stepped inside. The room was small, with rows of old machines humming softly. The single fluorescent light overhead buzzed faintly, casting harsh shadows in the corners. I set my basket on the nearest folding table and started loading my clothes into one of the washers. The sound of the coins dropping into the slot echoed loudly in the empty room. I pulled out my phone to pass the time while the machine ran, scrolling aimlessly and trying not to think about how quiet it was down there. After a while, I noticed something odd. The air felt heavier, like it does right before a storm. I couldn't explain it, but it made me uneasy. I looked around the room, but nothing seemed out of place. I told myself I was being ridiculous and went back to my phone. When the washer finished, I moved my clothes to the dryer. The metal drum clanged loudly as I tossed in my damp laundry. I set the timer and leaned against the table, listening to the steady whir of the dryer. That's when I heard it, a faint scuffing sound coming from the far corner of the room. I froze, my hand tightening around my phone. The noise stopped, and the room was silent again except for the dryer. I stared into the shadows, but I couldn't see anything past the edges of the light. My heart was pounding, but I told myself it was probably just the pipes or the building settling. I turned back to the dryer, trying to act like I wasn't spooked, but then the sound came again. This time, it was closer. It wasn't pipes or settling, it was footsteps, slow and deliberate, like someone was trying to stay quiet. I spun around, my eyes darting to the dark corners of the room. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. There was no answer. I backed up toward the door, my phone clutched tightly in my hand. When my back hit the door, I reached for the handle and twisted it. It didn't move. I tried again, pulling harder, but it was locked. I hadn't locked it when I came in, there was no lock on the inside. My chest tightened as panic set in. I turned around, pressing my back against the door, and scanned the room again. The shadows seemed deeper now, like they were swallowing the edges of the light. I could still hear the footsteps, but they'd stopped moving. Whoever it was, they were waiting, watching. My mind raced. I couldn't call for help, there was no reception in the basement. My only option was to get out of there. I took a shaky step forward, trying to make as little noise as possible. The shadows in the far corner seemed to shift, but I couldn't tell if it was real or just my imagination. As I moved closer to the machines, I saw something, a faint glint of metal catching the light. My stomach dropped. It was a knife, held low at someone's side. I couldn't see their face, but I could see the outline of their body now, half hidden behind one of the washers. I backed up slowly, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it would burst. The figure stepped forward, and I finally saw their face. It was a man, his expression blank, but his eyes were cold, empty. He didn't say anything, just kept moving toward me with that knife in his hand. I grabbed a metal laundry basket from the table and held it in front of me like a shield. "Stay back," I shouted, my voice shaking. The man didn't stop. He kept coming, his steps slow and deliberate. When he was just a few feet away, I threw the basket at him as hard as I could. It hit him in the chest, knocking him back a step, but it didn't stop him. I ran to the nearest machine and yanked open the door, pulling out a heavy, wet pair of jeans. I swung them at him, the fabric slapping against his arm. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make him pause. I took the chance to run for the door again, pulling at the handle with all my strength. It still wouldn't budge. Behind me, I could hear the man's footsteps getting closer. I looked around desperately and saw a metal pipe lying on the floor near the machines. I grabbed it, my hands trembling, and turned to face him. He was only a few feet away now, the knife still in his hand. He smiled, just a little, like he knew he had me cornered. My grip on the pipe tightened. "Stay back," I said again, my voice low and shaking. He lunged at me, and I swung the pipe as hard as I could. It connected with his shoulder, and he let out a grunt of pain, stumbling back. I didn't wait for him to recover. I swung again, hitting his arm this time, and the knife clattered to the floor. He lunged for it, but I kicked it away, my foot connecting with his hand. He snarled in frustration and grabbed my leg, pulling me down. I hit the floor hard, the pipe slipping from my grasp. He climbed on top of me, his hands wrapping around my throat. I couldn't breathe. I clawed at his hands, trying to break his grip, but he was too strong. My vision started to blur, and I felt myself slipping away. In a last-ditch effort, I reached for the pipe. My fingers brushed against it, and I grabbed it, swinging it upward with all the strength I had left. It hit him in the side of the head, and he fell off me, clutching his temple. I scrambled to my feet, gasping for air, and ran to the door again. This time, I didn't pull the handle. I threw my shoulder into the door as hard as I could. The wood splintered, and the door burst open. I ran up the stairs, my legs barely holding me, and didn't stop until I was in my apartment with the door locked behind me. I called the police, and they found him in the basement, unconscious and bleeding from where I'd hit him. They said he didn't live in the building and had likely been sneaking in through an old service entrance. I don't do my laundry at night anymore. It was late, past midnight, and the road ahead of me stretched out endlessly under the dim glow of my headlights. I had been driving for hours, cutting through the kind of rural highway where it felt like the world was asleep. There weren't any cars, just empty fields and trees that blurred together under the dark sky. The monotony started to weigh on me. I was tired but still had miles to go before I'd reach the motel I'd booked for the night. That's when I saw him, a figure walking along the side of the road, his thumb out. He was tall and lanky, wearing a hoodie and jeans, a backpack slung over one shoulder. I'm not the type to pick up hitchhikers, but something about the empty road in the late hour made me feel sorry for him. He looked harmless enough, and I figured he must have been stranded out here for hours. Against my better judgment, I slowed down and rolled down the passenger window. "Need a ride?" I asked. He nodded and gave me a small, tired smile. "If it's no trouble," he said. His voice was calm, almost soft. I unlocked the door, and he climbed in. As he settled into the seat, I noticed he kept his backpack on his lap, hugging it like a shield. He smelled faintly of sweat and dirt, but I didn't think much of it. He probably had been walking a long way. "Where are you headed?" I asked as I pulled back onto the road. "Just up ahead," he said, motioning vaguely down the highway. "I'll let you know when to stop." I nodded and focused on driving, but the silence in the car felt heavy. After a minute, he spoke. "You've been driving a while, haven't you?" he asked. "Yeah," I said. "Had to leave late." "Long trip." He said. "Must get lonely on the road, huh?" I shrugged. "I don't mind it." He didn't say anything after that for a bit, and I thought maybe he'd fall asleep. But then he spoke again. "You've got a nice car," he said. "Must have taken a lot of work to afford something like this." That caught me off guard. My car wasn't fancy, just a reliable old sedan. I glanced at him, but he was staring out the window like he'd just made a casual observation. "Not really," I said. "Just something to get me from A to B." He chuckled quietly. "Yeah, I guess you're not really the flashy type." I didn't respond. Something about the way he said it made me uneasy, like he thought he knew me. The next time he spoke, it was out of nowhere. "So, how's the divorce going?" I almost swerved off the road. My grip tightened on the steering wheel, and I turned to look at him, my heart racing. "What did you say?" He didn't look at me, just kept staring out the window. "The divorce," he said. "Must be rough, huh? Splitting everything up, trying to figure out who gets what." I felt cold all over. I hadn't told him anything about myself, not even my name. I hadn't mentioned the divorce to anyone outside my close circle of friends and family. "How do you know about that?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. He finally turned to face me, his expression unreadable. "Just a lucky guess," he said with a small smile. I didn't believe him. My mind raced, trying to figure out how he could know. Maybe he'd seen me somewhere before, overheard a conversation, but out here, in the middle of nowhere? It didn't make sense. Look, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I don't know who you are, but if you know me from somewhere, you better tell me now. He tilted his head slightly, like he was amused. I don't know you, he said. But it's funny, isn't it? The way people put everything out there. Online, in public. You'd be surprised what you can find if you look hard enough. My stomach churned. He was right, maybe he found me online somehow, pieced together bits of information. But why? And how would he even know I'd be driving down this road tonight? The tension in the car was suffocating now. I kept glancing at him out of the corner of my eye, watching for any sudden movements. He still hadn't let go of his backpack, his hands gripping the straps tightly. You've got a daughter, don't you? He said suddenly. My breath caught in my throat. What? A little girl. 7, right? Cute kid. Panic set in. He knew too much. My hands trembled on the wheel as I tried to keep my voice calm. Get out, I said. He didn't move. We're in the middle of nowhere, he said. You're not just gonna leave me out here. I said, get out, I repeated, my voice shaking. He turned to me, his expression hardening. You're not gonna do that, he said. Because you're scared. And I don't blame you. My heart pounded as I realized he was right. I couldn't force him out of the car without stopping, and I didn't want to stop, not with him so close. He seemed to sense my hesitation and leaned back in his seat, like he had all the time in the world. You've got a lot to lose, he said. Your job, your kid, what was it? A little house on the corner with the blue shutters. My blood ran cold. He wasn't guessing anymore, he knew. I didn't know how, but he did. And he wanted me to know he did. I couldn't think straight. My only thought was to get to a well-lit area, somewhere with other people. I pressed harder on the gas, the car speeding up. He didn't seem to care. He just sat there, calm, like he was waiting for something. When the lights of a gas station appeared in the distance, I felt a surge of hope. I pulled into the lot and stopped the car abruptly. Get out, I said again, my voice firmer this time. He stared at me for a moment, then opened the door slowly. Before he stepped out, he leaned in close, his voice low. You should be more careful, he said. Not everyone's as nice as me. Then he was gone, disappearing into the darkness. I locked the doors and drove away as fast as I could, my hands shaking the whole time. I didn't stop until I reached the motel, where I'd parked right by the entrance and didn't leave my room until morning. I still don't know who he was or how he knew so much about me. But I never drive that stretch of road alone anymore. And I don't stop for anyone. The call came out of the blue. I remember I was washing dishes when my phone buzzed on the counter. It was a number I didn't recognize, but I answered anyway. A cheerful woman on the other end said I'd want a free deep cleaning service. She mentioned my name, my address. She said it was a promotional offer to advertise their company in the neighborhood. I'd never heard of the company before, but I figured maybe they'd gotten my info through one of those home improvement flyers I'd signed up for. I hesitated at first. It felt too good to be true, but she was polite, professional. She explained the details clearly. 2 people would come to my house the next day, bring all their own supplies, and clean everything for free. No strings attached. She even gave me the name of the cleaners, a man named Peter and a woman named Erin. I agreed, thinking it couldn't hurt. Who doesn't want a clean house without lifting a finger? The next day, they arrived on time, just after 10 a.m. A white van with the company logo pulled into my driveway. The logo looked generic, a simple broom and bucket design, but it wasn't like I was inspecting it too closely. Peter and Erin stepped out. He was tall and broad-shouldered with short, dark hair, while she was smaller, wearing her hair pulled back into a ponytail. They both wore matching polo shirts with the logo embroidered on the chest. They were friendly, smiling as they introduced themselves. Peter carried a large duffel bag filled with supplies, and Erin held a clipboard, asking me to confirm my address and sign a quick form. It looked legit enough. I let them in and showed them around, pointing out the rooms I thought could use the most attention. They nodded, making polite small talk as I spoke. Peter asked if I'd be home while they worked, and I told him yes. I didn't think anything of it at the time, but looking back, I remember how his eyes lingered on me after I said it. They started in the kitchen. I stayed in the living room, trying to give them space. The house felt unusually quiet, except for the occasional clink of dishes and the low hum of a vacuum. I tried to focus on reading a book, but something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it. Maybe it was the way they didn't talk to each other at all while they worked, or the way Peter kept glancing over at me whenever he passed through the living room to grab supplies from the van. About an hour in, Erin came into the living room. She smiled and said they were making good progress but needed to move some furniture in the bedroom to clean properly. She asked if I could help Peter with that while she finished up in the kitchen. It seemed like a strange request, they were the cleaners, after all, but I agreed. I followed Peter to the bedroom, feeling a little uneasy. When we got there, he pointed to the dresser. "It's heavy," he said. "Might be easier if we just slide it a little." I nodded and bent down to grab one end. As soon as my hands touched the wood, I felt him behind me, way too close. I straightened up quickly, and he stepped back, raising his hands like he hadn't meant to startle me. "Sorry," he said. "Didn't mean to crowd you." I brushed it off, but my stomach was tight with unease. We moved the dresser, and I left the room as quickly as I could, telling him I'd be in the living room if they needed me. I didn't go back to my book. Instead, I sat there, listening. It was too quiet. No more clinking, no vacuum noise, just muffled footsteps and the occasional creak of furniture being moved. Something wasn't right. I decided to check on them, starting with the kitchen. It looked spotless, gleaming like it had just been scrubbed top to bottom. But Erin wasn't there. I called out her name, but there was no answer. My pulse quickened as I checked the other rooms, one by one. The bathroom was empty. The guest room, too. When I got to the bedroom, Peter was there, rummaging through my nightstand. My heart dropped. He didn't notice me at first, too focused on whatever he was looking for. I backed away, planning to grab my phone and call the police, but I must have made a noise because he turned around. His face changed instantly, the friendly demeanor replaced by something cold and calculating. "Looking for something?" I asked, my voice shaking. He didn't answer. Instead, he stepped toward me, blocking the doorway. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears as I realized Erin wasn't anywhere in the house. She was probably outside, acting as a lookout. "Why don't you sit down?" Peter said, his voice calm but firm. "Let's talk." I didn't move. "Get out of my house," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. He took another step closer. "You don't want to make this difficult." I ran. I bolted past him, shoving him hard enough to knock him off balance, and sprinted for the front door. As I reached it, Erin appeared out of nowhere, blocking my way. She grabbed my arm, her grip like a vice. I twisted free and grabbed the nearest thing I could find, a heavy ceramic vase, and swung it at her. It hit her shoulder, and she stumbled, giving me just enough time to unlock the door and run outside. I didn't stop running until I reached my neighbor's house. I banged on their door, screaming for help. The elderly couple who lived there let me in, and I called the police while they locked the doors and windows. When the officers arrived, Peter and Erin were gone. So was the van. They'd taken more than just my valuables. My laptop, jewelry, and cash were missing, but so were things that felt more personal: an old photo album, a set of keys, even some of my mail. The police said it was likely a team targeting homes under the guise of legitimate services, but it felt worse than that. It felt like they wanted to leave me shaken, to make me feel unsafe in my own home. I never found out who they really were. They vanished without a trace, leaving behind only the fear that someone, somewhere, still had my information. I don't open my door to strangers anymore, no matter how friendly they seem. It started as nothing unusual. My roommate, Amy, mentioned that a friend of hers, Jake, needed a place to crash for a few nights. He was moving to the city and had some delays with his apartment. It didn't seem like a big deal. I barely spent time at home anyway, and Amy had always been respectful of boundaries. The first few days were fine. Jake was polite, if a bit quiet. He kept to himself in the living room where we'd set up the couch for him. He even washed the dishes a couple of times, which I appreciated. But by the end of the first week, I started noticing little things that made me uncomfortable. He was always around. Always. I worked late hours, but no matter when I came home, he was there. Sometimes he'd just be sitting in the living room, staring at his phone with the TV, not really doing anything. Other times, I'd catch him standing in the kitchen, just sort of lingering. He didn't seem to have anywhere to go or anything to do. When I asked Amy about it, she shrugged and said his move-in date had been pushed back. She didn't seem bothered, so I tried not to be either. One night, I came home late after a work event. The apartment was dark except for the faint glow of the TV. Jake was on the couch, but he wasn't watching it. He was looking at me. He didn't say anything, just stared as I walked through the door. Long day, I mumbled, more to myself than him, and headed to my room. As I closed the door, I caught a glimpse of him still watching me, his face blank. It was unsettling, but I told myself he was probably just tired. I locked my bedroom door that night, something I'd never done before. The next morning, I noticed something odd. My favorite coffee mug was on the kitchen counter, half filled with what looked like cold coffee. It was weird because I hadn't used it in days, and Amy rarely used my stuff without asking. I rinsed it out, chalking it up to one of them grabbing it by mistake. Things escalated quickly after that. One evening, I came home and found Jake in the hallway outside my bedroom door. He was holding a book, a novel I'd been reading the week before and had left on my nightstand. "This is yours, right?" he asked, holding it out to me. I nodded, confused. "Yeah. Where'd you find it?" "In the living room," he said casually, though I knew for a fact I hadn't brought it out there. "Thought you might have forgotten it." "Thanks," I said, taking it from him and retreating to my room. I checked the lock on my door again that night. From then on, Jake's behavior grew more invasive. I started noticing my belongings out of place. A scarf that had been hanging on the back of my chair ended up folded neatly on the couch. A pair of earrings I hadn't worn in weeks appeared on the bathroom counter. My laundry basket, which I always kept in my closet, was suddenly in the middle of my room one day when I got home. I confronted Amy about it, but she brushed me off. "He's harmless," she said. "Probably just trying to be helpful. He's not used to living with roommates." But it didn't feel harmless. There was an edge to the way he looked at me now, an intensity that made my skin crawl. I started avoiding him as much as possible, leaving early and staying out late. I even considered staying at a hotel, but I didn't want to seem dramatic. Besides, I couldn't exactly afford it. The breaking point came one night when I was getting ready for bed. I heard a faint noise outside my window, like scratching. I lived on the second floor, so it couldn't have been an animal. My heart raced as I crept toward the window, peeking through the blinds. Jake was standing in the alley below, looking up at my window. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there in the dark. I backed away, my hand shaking, and grabbed my phone. I texted Amy, asking where Jake was. Her reply came quickly. "He went out for a walk." "Why?" I didn't sleep that night. I kept the lights off and stayed curled up on my bed, listening for any sound outside my door. The next morning, I told Amy Jake needed to leave. She looked annoyed but agreed to talk to him. That evening, Jake cornered me in the kitchen. He was calm, almost too calm, as he leaned against the counter and stared at me. "Amy said you're not comfortable with me being here," he said, his voice low. I nodded, keeping my distance. It's been a while, and this wasn't supposed to be permanent." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You don't have to be scared of me, you know. I'm not going to hurt you." The way he said it made my stomach twist. I didn't respond, just backed away and went to my room, locking the door behind me. That night, I woke up to the sound of my doorknob rattling. My heart pounded as I sat up, staring at the door. The rattling stopped, but then I heard a soft knock. "Are you awake?" Jake's voice was muffled through the door. "I just want to talk." I didn't say anything, holding my breath as the silence stretched out. After what felt like an eternity, I heard his footsteps retreat down the hall. The next morning, I packed a bag and left. I didn't tell Amy. I didn't care what she thought anymore. I stayed with a friend for a week while I found a new place. Amy texted me a few times, asking what was going on, but I never replied. I don't know what happened to Jake after that. I don't want to know. All I know is that I never felt safe in that apartment again, and I'll never take a stranger's presence in my home lightly. It started with a headache. Nothing unusual, just the kind that comes on after a long day at work. I get migraines sometimes, so I went to the pharmacy after work to pick up my prescription refill. They know me there, so it was quick. The tech handed me the bag, we exchanged small smiles, and I left. I took the first pill when I got home, around 6. Within an hour, I started to feel strange. My headache was gone, but something else wasn't right. My heart was racing, and my hands felt jittery, like I had too much coffee. I figured it was just stress from the day and tried to brush it off. I made myself dinner, but I couldn't eat much. My stomach felt tight, and my chest had this heavy feeling that I couldn't shake. By 8, things got worse. My vision started to blur. It was subtle at first, just edges going soft, but then it became hard to focus on anything. I thought maybe I was having a bad reaction to the medication, so I grabbed the bottle to check. That's when I noticed it. The pills were different. They weren't the usual round white ones I'd been taking for years. These were small, blue capsules. I felt this cold wave of dread wash over me. I double-checked the label on the bottle. It had my name, my doctor's name, the right prescription number. But the pills inside weren't mine. I called the pharmacy right away. The phone rang for what felt like forever before someone picked up. I explained the situation to the tech who answered, trying to keep calm. She told me to hold on while she checked my file. I could hear her typing, the faint hum of background noise from the store. Then she came back on the line. "Ma'am, the pills we dispensed to you today should have been your regular prescription." "Are you saying they're not?" "No," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "They're blue capsules. That's not what I usually get." She sounded confused. "That's strange. Let me check with the pharmacist." "Hold on." I waited, clutching the phone so tightly my hand hurt. When she came back, her voice had this strange tone, apologetic, but also like she was trying to stay calm herself. "The pharmacist says there's no record of a substitution for your medication. You should bring the bottle in first thing tomorrow morning so we can take a look." "Tomorrow?" I repeated, my voice rising. "I'm already feeling sick. I need to know what these are now." She hesitated. "If you're feeling unwell, you should go to the emergency room." That wasn't the answer I wanted, but I didn't have much choice. I hung up and tried looking up the pills online, using the markings on them to identify them. Nothing came up. It was like they didn't exist. My chest tightened, and I started to feel dizzy. I knew I couldn't wait. I grabbed my keys and headed to the hospital. The ER was packed. I told the nurse at the desk about the pills and how I was feeling. She asked for the bottle and went to speak with someone in the back. I sat there under the harsh fluorescent lights, feeling like my skin was crawling. My hands wouldn't stop shaking, and I kept glancing at the door, half expecting someone to walk in looking for me. Finally, they called me back. The doctor took my vitals and asked me a bunch of questions about the pills and where I got them. I handed him the bottle, and he frowned as he examined it. Then he left the room without saying much. When he came back, he looked serious. "These pills aren't in our database," he said. "We're going to run some tests to see what's in your system." They drew blood and hooked me up to a monitor. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying not to panic. After what felt like hours, the doctor came back. His expression was even grimmer. "There's a stimulant in your system," he said. "It's not something we typically see prescribed. Have you taken anything else today?" "No," I said, my voice shaking. "Just a pill from that bottle." He nodded, but he didn't look convinced. "We'll keep monitoring you, but you need to follow up with the pharmacy. Something's not adding up here." I stayed at the hospital until my heart rate stabilized. By the time I got home, it was nearly 3 in the morning. I felt exhausted but wired at the same time, like my body couldn't decide what to do. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the bottle of pills. I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't a mistake. The next morning, I went back to the pharmacy. The same tech was there, and her face turned pale when she saw me. She called the pharmacist over, a man I'd seen dozens of times before. I handed him the bottle and told him everything that had happened. He opened the bottle, poured a few pills into his hand, and frowned. "These aren't from us," he said, his voice flat. "What do you mean?" I asked. "I picked them up here yesterday." He shook his head. "We don't stock this medication. This isn't something we'd ever dispense." My stomach dropped. Then how did I get them? He exchanged a glance with the tech, who looked terrified. "Let me check our records," he said, and disappeared into the back. When he came back, he looked even more serious. "There's no record of this prescription being filled yesterday," he said. "According to our system, your refill is still pending." I stared at him, my mind racing. But I was here. I picked it up. "She gave it to me," I said, pointing at the tech. The tech looked like she wanted to disappear. "I don't remember filling it," she said weakly. I don't know how this happened." I left the pharmacy feeling worse than ever. If they didn't fill the prescription, who did? How did those pills end up in a bottle with my name on it? I called my doctor's office and explained everything. They were as confused as I was. They told me to bring the pills in for testing, but by then, I was too scared to hold on to them. I threw them away that night, every last one, and double-checked that my doors and windows were locked. I don't know if I'll ever find out what happened. Maybe it was a mistake, some mix-up that no one wants to admit. But deep down, I don't believe that. Someone tampered with my medication, and it wasn't random. Someone wanted me to take those pills, and I have no idea why. I had been on the app for a few months, not really looking for anything serious, but open to seeing where things might go. Her profile caught my eye because it seemed normal, and that felt rare. No over-edited selfies, no vague inspirational quotes, just a few casual photos and a short bio. Her name was Jessica, or at least that's what the profile said. She liked hiking, coffee shops, and trying new things. She messaged me first, which doesn't usually happen, and we hit it off quickly. We decided to meet at a small cafe halfway between where we both said we lived. The place was quiet when I got there. It was early evening, still light outside. The kind of place where they serve overpriced lattes and everything smells like vanilla and cinnamon. I sat by the window and waited. I wasn't nervous, but I kept checking my phone to make sure I hadn't gotten the time wrong. 5 minutes turned into 10, then 15. Just as I started thinking she wasn't going to show, I saw her walk in. She looked like her pictures, or close enough that I didn't think twice. Brown hair, pulled back in a loose ponytail, wearing jeans and a sweater. She smiled when she spotted me, a little shy, and came over. "Sorry I'm late," she said, sitting down across from me. Traffic was bad. I told her it was no problem. She didn't bring anything with her, not even a purse, but I didn't think much of it at the time. We started talking, and at first, it was fine. Normal. She asked about my job, my family, what I like to do in my free time. She seemed interested but didn't offer much about herself. Whenever I tried to turn the conversation back to her, she gave short answers and then shifted it back to me. After about 20 minutes, I noticed she wasn't drinking anything. I offered to grab her something from the counter, but she shook her head. "I'm not thirsty," she said. That's when I started to feel a little uneasy. Something about her tone was off. It wasn't rude, but it was flat. Like she was saying the words without really meaning them. I brushed it off and kept talking, but the feeling didn't go away. Then she started asking questions that didn't feel right. At first, they were harmless stuff about where I lived or what my schedule was like. But then she got more specific. She wanted to know if I lived alone, if my place had any roommates, if I usually got home late from work. I laughed it off. made a joke about how that sounded like something a stalker would ask. She didn't laugh. Her face didn't change at all. "I just like to get to know people," she said. I nodded, but inside, I was starting to feel like I needed to leave. Something about the way she was looking at me, it was too direct, like she wasn't looking at me but through me. I glanced at my phone, pretending to check the time. "Actually, I should probably get going soon," I said. "I have an early morning tomorrow." Her expression didn't change. "We've only just started," she said. There was no frustration in her voice, no disappointment. Just a statement, like she was reading it off a script. "I know," I said, forcing a smile. "But it's been great meeting you." I stood up, hoping she'd take the hint. She didn't. She stayed seated, staring at me with this blank, unreadable expression. For a second, I thought she might say something, but she just watched as I grabbed my jacket. When I turned to leave, she finally stood up. "Let me walk you to your car," she said. "That's okay," I said quickly. "I'll be fine." She smiled again, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I insist." I didn't know how to say no without making it weird, so I nodded and walked toward the door, hoping she'd change her mind or get distracted. She didn't. She followed me out into the parking lot. It was almost dark by then, and the lot was mostly empty. My car was parked near the back, under one of the few working lights. I could hear her footsteps behind me, steady and deliberate. When we got to my car, I turned to face her. "Thanks for walking me," I said, trying to sound casual. "Drive safe." She didn't respond. She was standing closer than I expected, just a few feet away, and her eyes were locked on mine. I opened the car door, hoping she'd take the hint, but she didn't move. "Are you sure you're okay to drive?" she asked. Her voice was softer now, almost concerned. "You seem a little off." "I'm fine," I said quickly. "Just tired." She tilted her head, like she was studying me. "Maybe you should sit for a minute. Catch your breath." Something in her tone made my stomach twist. "I'm really fine," I said, sliding into the driver's seat. "Good night." I reached for the door to close it, but she didn't step back. Instead, she leaned down, her face inches from mine. "You shouldn't leave yet," she said. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it sent a chill down my spine. "I have to go," I said firmly, my hand gripping the door. Before I could pull it shut, she reached out and grabbed the edge of the door, holding it open. Her grip was strong, too strong for someone her size. I felt a jolt of panic as I realized I couldn't close the door without pushing her away, and I didn't want to escalate things. "Let go," I said, my voice shaking. She didn't move. "You don't understand," she said, her tone almost pleading now. "It's not safe for you to leave." My heart was racing. I didn't know what she meant, but I wasn't about to stick around to find out. I shoved the door hard, forcing her to step back, and slammed it shut. She didn't try to stop me, just stood there as I started the car. As I backed out of the parking space, she didn't move. She just stood there, watching me with that same blank expression. I drove away as fast as I could, my hands shaking on the wheel. When I got home, I locked all the doors and checked the windows twice. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, those cold, empty eyes staring at me. The next day, I deleted the app and blocked her number. I don't know who she was or what she wanted, but I don't think it was a date. I was home that day because I called in sick. It wasn't anything serious, just a cold, but I felt run down and figured I'd take the day to rest. My building is old, and it's not unusual for something to break or need fixing. So, when I heard a knock on the door around noon, I didn't think twice. I assumed it was management sending someone up to look at something, even though I hadn't put in a request. I wrapped myself in a blanket, shuffled to the door, and checked the peephole. A man in his late 30s or early 40s was standing there, wearing a dark blue jumpsuit with a name tag I couldn't quite read. He had a toolbox in one hand and a clipboard in the other. "Maintenance," he said when I opened the door a crack. His voice was casual but firm. "Here to check the pipes." I blinked at him, still half asleep. "Pipes?" I asked. I hadn't noticed any issues, but then again, I'd been out of it all morning. "Yeah, building-wide inspection," he said, glancing down at his clipboard. "Shouldn't take long." I hesitated for a second. The management usually sent out emails or left notices if there was work being done, but maybe I'd missed it. My brain felt foggy, and I didn't want to cause a fuss, so I opened the door and let him in. He walked straight to the kitchen, not waiting for me to say anything else. His boots left faint prints on the hardwood floor, which annoyed me more than it should have. I trailed behind him, still clutching my blanket, and watched as he knelt down to open the cabinet under the sink. He rummaged through his toolbox, pulling out a wrench and some other tools I didn't recognize. "Got a bit of a leak in the unit below you," he said without looking up. "Just need to make sure it's not coming from here." "Oh," I said. That made sense, I guessed. I leaned against the counter, not sure what to do with myself. He worked quietly for a while, occasionally muttering something under his breath. I tried to relax, but there was something about him that felt off. For one, he didn't look like the usual maintenance guys who worked in the building. They were older, friendlier. This guy was wiry and jittery, like he had too much caffeine. His movements were quick, almost jerky, and he kept glancing around the room like he was checking for something. "Are you new here?" I asked, trying to make conversation. He paused for a moment, then nodded. "Yeah. Just started a few weeks ago." I nodded back, but something about the way he said it didn't sit right with me. His tone was too casual, like he'd rehearsed the answer. I decided to let it go and went to sit on the couch while he worked. I figured the faster he finished, the sooner I could get back to resting. But after about 10 minutes, I realized he wasn't making much noise. I glanced toward the kitchen and saw him standing there, staring at the doorway that led to my bedroom. His head was tilted slightly, and his expression was blank. It made my stomach twist. "Everything okay?" I asked, forcing my voice to stay steady. He turned to look at me, and for a moment he didn't answer. Then he smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Yeah, all good. Just checking for signs of water damage." I nodded, but my hands felt clammy. Something wasn't right. I picked up my phone from the coffee table and opened my email, scrolling to see if there'd been any notice about maintenance work. Nothing. No emails, no updates. My heart started to race. I stood up, trying to act casual. "I'm just going to call the management office," I said. "Double-check that everything's on the schedule." His smile disappeared. "No need for that," he said quickly. "I've got the work order right here." He patted the clipboard, but he didn't hand it to me. "I'd feel better checking," I said, taking a step toward the kitchen. He moved to block my path. It wasn't an aggressive movement, not exactly, but it was deliberate. My pulse was pounding now, but I forced myself to stay calm. "Really, there's no need," he said, his voice lower now. "I'll be out of your hair in a few minutes." I looked at his toolbox, which was still sitting on the floor. The tools inside were mismatched, like they'd been thrown together from different sets. None of them looked particularly clean, and some didn't even look like they belonged to a plumber or maintenance worker. My mind was racing. I needed to get him out of my apartment, but I didn't want to make him angry. "Actually," I said, forcing a smile, "I'm feeling a little under the weather. Maybe we can reschedule?" He didn't move. "I'm almost done," he said flatly. I took a step back, trying to put some distance between us. "I think I'd rather wait," I said, my voice shaking a little now. His eyes flicked to the phone in my hand, and I saw his jaw tighten. For a second, I thought he was going to argue, but then he nodded. "All right," he said. "Your call." He picked up his toolbox and headed for the door. I followed him, keeping a few feet of space between us. When he reached the door, he paused and looked back at me. His expression was unreadable. "You should get that lock checked," he said. "Doesn't seem very secure." I didn't say anything. I just waited until he stepped out and then closed the door behind him, turning the deadbolt as fast as I could. My hands were shaking so badly that it took me a couple of tries. As soon as the door was locked, I called the management office. The woman who answered sounded confused when I told her what happened. "We didn't send anyone up today," she said. "There's no work schedule for your unit." I felt like the floor dropped out from under me. "Are you sure?" I asked. He had a clipboard and tools. He said there was a leak. She paused. "No," she said firmly. "We don't have anyone like that working for us." I hung up and called the police next. They took my statement and sent someone to check the building, but by the time they arrived, the man was long gone. The officer who came to my apartment said it was a good thing I hadn't let him stay longer. "He was probably casing the place," he said, "looking for valuables or waiting for a chance to catch you off guard." I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, the way he'd stared at my bedroom door. The next day, I had the locks changed and bought a security camera. I still don't know who he was or what he wanted, but I know it wasn't to fix my pipes. I moved into the apartment about 6 months ago. It's not a big place, just a one-bedroom on the second floor, but it's enough for me. The building is old, with creaky floors and thin walls. My neighbor across the hall was this elderly woman named Mrs. Garrett. She seemed harmless at first. She lived alone, always had her TV on too loud, and her door smelled faintly of mothballs and some kind of cheap perfume. We didn't talk much at first, just polite nods when we passed in the hallway. But one day, she stopped me as I was coming home from work. She was carrying a small bag of groceries, and her hands were trembling. "Could you help me with this?" she asked. Her voice was frail, like it might crack at any second. "Of course," I said, taking the bag from her. It wasn't heavy, but she looked so relieved, like I'd just done her the biggest favor in the world. I carried it into her apartment, and she asked if I wanted a cup of tea as thanks. I didn't want to be rude, so I said yes. Her place was cluttered but clean, full of old furniture and stacks of magazines. She had pictures of what I assumed were her family on the walls, kids, grandkids, maybe a husband from years ago. She made tea and talked about how her children didn't visit much and how lonely she was. I felt bad for her. She seemed so sweet and sad. When I finally left, she thanked me again and said I was a kind young man. After that, I started helping her out now and then. I'd carry her groceries up the stairs, change light bulbs, little things like that. She'd always insist on making tea or offering me cookies, but I didn't always stay. She'd sometimes stand in her doorway and watch me walk back to my apartment, which I thought was a little strange but didn't think too much about. Then, things started to get weird. The first time, I was heading out early for work. It must have been around 6:30 in the morning, and she was standing in the hallway. Just standing there, in her nightgown, staring at my door. "Mrs. Garrett?" I said, startled. She smiled like she'd been expecting me. "Oh, good morning," she said. "I thought I heard you up." I hadn't made any noise, though. I'd just woken up and hadn't even turned on the TV. I chalked it up to her being lonely and said I had to go. She nodded, but she didn't move until I was down the stairs. The next time, I came home late. It was past 10, and I was exhausted. When I got to my door, I saw a piece of paper taped to it. It was a note in shaky handwriting. "Just wanted to check if you were okay. You didn't come home at your usual time. Mrs. G." That sent a chill down my spine. I didn't have a usual time. My schedule was all over the place. How would she know that? I left the note on my counter and decided not to think about it. A few days later, I was in bed watching a show on my laptop when I heard something outside my door. It was faint at first, like a shuffle, then louder, like someone brushing against the door. I froze. My apartment's layout meant I couldn't see the door from where I was, but I could hear it. My heart was pounding as I got up, grabbed a heavy flashlight, and looked through the peephole. She was standing there. Just standing, staring at the door. Her face was inches away from it. She wasn't knocking or saying anything, just breathing heavily. I stepped back, not sure what to do. After what felt like forever, she turned and went back to her apartment. I barely slept that night. The next morning, I avoided her. I didn't even peek into the hallway before leaving. When I came back, there was another note on my door. "You didn't say hello this morning. I hope everything's all right. Mrs. G." That's when I decided I needed to set some boundaries. I knocked on her door later that day, and when she answered, I told her, as politely as I could, that I appreciated her concern but that I needed some space. Her face fell. For a moment, she just stared at me, her lips twitching like she was trying to find the right words. Then she said, "I thought we were friends." "We are," I said quickly, not wanting to upset her. Work has been busy, and I need some time to myself." She didn't say anything else. She just closed the door. For a while, things were quiet. She stopped leaving notes, and I didn't see her in the hallway. I thought maybe she'd taken what I said to heart. But then, one night, I woke up to a noise in my apartment. At first, I thought I was dreaming. It was a faint creak, like someone stepping on the floor. My building was old, so noises weren't unusual, but this sounded deliberate. I sat up in bed, my heart racing, and listened. Another creak, closer this time. I grabbed my phone and the flashlight I kept by my bed. I didn't call anyone right away, not wanting to jump to conclusions. I crept out of bed and into the living room. That's when I saw her. She was standing by the window, holding one of my picture frames. Her back was to me, but I knew it was her. The white hair, the hunched shoulders, it was Mrs. Garrett. "Mrs. Garrett?" I said, my voice shaking. She turned slowly, like she wasn't surprised to see me. She was holding the picture of my family. "You didn't lock your door," she said softly. "I was worried about you." I couldn't move. I just stood there, staring at her. "You can't be here," I said finally. You need to leave. Her face twisted into something I'd never seen before. Anger, maybe, or hurt. I was just trying to help, she said. You don't have anyone else. You need me. I stepped back, my hand gripping my phone. I'm calling the police, I said, my voice firmer now. She didn't move at first. Then she set the picture down and walked toward the door. You'll regret this, she said quietly before leaving. The police came and took a report. They said there wasn't much they could do since she hadn't hurt me or stolen anything. But they talked to her, and I didn't see her again after that. A week later, her apartment was empty. Management said she'd moved out suddenly, no forwarding address. I changed my locks, but I still feel like she's out there, watching. It started off as just a simple trip to the park. My son, Jake, had been asking to go to the playground for days, but work had kept me busy. We didn't have anything planned for that evening, so I figured we could take a walk after dinner, just the two of us. It was about 8:30 when we left the house, and I figured we'd have enough time to enjoy the park before it got too dark. The park was only a few blocks away, and I wasn't expecting any issues. The park was usually quiet at night. I'd walked through there many times before, either to get some fresh air or when Jake had trouble sleeping, and it felt like the kind of place you could walk through without worrying about much. I wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary. We got there just as the last rays of sunlight were disappearing, leaving the park bathed in a faint, blue glow from the street lamps. Jake was excited, running ahead toward the swings. I followed him, pulling my jacket tighter as the evening air got a bit cooler. He was laughing as I pushed him, his joy always putting a smile on my face. I glanced around and noticed a few other people in the distance. A couple sitting on a bench, and a man walking his dog, both just far enough that I didn't think much of them. The sounds of the city were muffled by the trees and the distance. It was peaceful. We stayed there for a while. Jake had been playing on the jungle gym, running around like a whirlwind while I sat on a bench, keeping an eye on him. I lost track of time, which I usually didn't do. But there was something about the calm of the evening that made it easy to just let the minutes slip by. It wasn't until I noticed that the park seemed quieter that I checked my watch. It was 9:45. I stood up, called for Jake, and told him it was time to go. He was reluctant, as most kids are, but I wasn't in the mood to argue. The air had gotten colder, and I knew that if we stayed too long, it would be harder to leave. But when I looked around, that's when I realized something wasn't right. The park, which had seemed so lively earlier, was now completely empty. I could still hear the distant hum of the city, but everything else, the other walkers, the people on the benches, had disappeared. There was no one around. It was just us now, and for some reason, the silence felt unnerving. I called Jake over again, this time a little more firmly, and he trotted over to me. As we turned to leave, I noticed a man standing near the gate, just a few yards away. He wasn't doing anything in particular, just standing there, watching us. I didn't think much of it at first. People sometimes hang around in parks at night, I figured. He was dressed in a dark coat, but the fact that he was standing so still bothered me. I nudged Jake's shoulder and said, "Let's go, buddy." We started walking toward the exit, but as we got closer to the gate, I noticed the man was now standing at the entrance, blocking the way. He was just standing there, his hands in his pockets. I tried to shake it off, but the hairs on the back of my neck were standing up. I didn't want to make a scene or get Jake nervous, but I could feel the tension building in my chest. We slowed down, and I caught sight of the man's face for the first time. He wasn't smiling, but his eyes were wide open, and his gaze felt fixed on us. There was something unnerving about it. Something off. He was staring at us, but it wasn't like he was just looking at us as strangers. It was more intense. Like he had some sort of interest in us. As I got closer, I instinctively pulled Jake closer to me. I reached into my jacket pocket and felt for my phone, just in case. "Excuse me," I said, my voice sounding more nervous than I'd intended. "Could you move aside? We need to get through." The man didn't answer. He just stood there, his eyes fixed on me, his expression unreadable. I didn't want to push things, but at that point, I could feel the knot in my stomach tightening. I glanced around quickly, but the park was still eerily empty. I took another step toward him, feeling a surge of anxiety. "Please," I said, trying to sound calm. "We need to go." The man shifted slightly, blocking the gate completely. He hadn't spoken a word yet, but something about the way he moved made my blood run cold. He wasn't even making an effort to step aside. It was like he was daring us to try to leave. I looked down at Jake, who was clinging to my side, sensing the change in the air. He didn't say anything, but I could feel him stiffen, as though he knew something wasn't right either. I took a deep breath. "Jake, we're going to walk the other way. We're just going to go around the park and out the other side, okay?" Jake nodded, and I pulled him gently by the hand, trying to stay calm. But the moment we turned around, I heard footsteps behind us. At first, they were faint, but then they got louder, quickening as they came closer. I tried to ignore them, but the sound grew more urgent. Someone was following us. I didn't look back. I kept walking, Jake's hand tight in mine. I told myself I was just being paranoid. Maybe it was just a jogger. Maybe it was someone else heading out of the park. But something about it didn't sit right with me. The footsteps grew faster, closer. I turned a corner, keeping my eyes ahead. I glanced over at Jake. "We're almost there, buddy." "Just a little bit longer," I said, trying to keep the edge out of my voice. But then I heard it. The unmistakable sound of someone blocking our path. The same man, now standing directly in front of us. He was closer this time, his face more visible. His lips curled into a thin, tight smile. It was the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Where are you going?" he asked, his voice low and deliberate. I froze. My heart was hammering in my chest. I need you to let us go," I said, my voice shaking despite myself. "We're leaving. We're not causing any trouble." The man didn't respond. Instead, he took a slow step forward. My body reacted before my brain could catch up. I grabbed Jake's hand tighter and pulled him in the opposite direction, heading back toward the far side of the park. I wasn't sure what I was doing. My mind was racing. I didn't know if this man had a weapon or what he wanted, but I knew we needed to get out of there. As I turned a corner, I heard the footsteps again. Faster. Louder. I glanced back, and there he was, right behind us, still not saying anything. But the way he was walking, the way he kept gaining on us, it was like he was daring us to run. We were trapped. I had no idea what to do. My thoughts were moving too fast, but my body felt frozen. My instincts kicked in, and I did the only thing I could think of. I ran. I grabbed Jake and bolted for the nearest exit, ignoring everything else. I could hear the man's footsteps following, but I didn't look back. I focused only on the path ahead. By some miracle, we made it out. As I finally reached the street, I looked over my shoulder and saw the man standing just inside the park, not moving. He was still watching us, but he didn't follow. I don't know what would have happened if we hadn't left when we did, but I'm sure it wouldn't have been good. We didn't go back to the park for weeks. I still get nervous when we walk by it. I don't know who that man was or why he wanted to trap us there, but I'm just glad we got away. Every time I think about that night, I can still feel the fear, the weight of his gaze on us, and the certainty that he was waiting for something. Maybe waiting for us to stay a little too long. I can't believe I'm even writing this down, but I have to. I don't know what else to do. The whole thing felt so real, but when I try to tell people, they look at me like I'm crazy. It's been almost a week since it happened, and I still can't shake the feeling that someone's watching me. It started like any other morning. I woke up a little later than usual, but it didn't really matter because I knew I had plenty of time to catch my usual train. I'm a commuter, so I'm used to the rush, the noise, the usual mix of tired faces. I get on the 7:30 train every day, same routine, same crowd. I'm not a morning person, but I've gotten used to it over the years. So that morning, I boarded the train, grabbed my usual spot by the door, and set my bag down on the floor between my feet. It's a crowded train, so I don't usually look too closely at the people around me. Everyone's got their face in their phones or eyes closed, trying to steal a few more minutes of sleep. It wasn't until we reached the next stop that I noticed something strange. I was zoning out, probably checking my phone or trying to avoid eye contact with people, when a guy next to me stood up to leave. I saw him grab his bag, or at least I thought he did. It wasn't until he was halfway out of the door that I realized he'd left his backpack on the seat next to me. I don't know why I did it, but I picked it up. I figured he'd forgotten it, and maybe he'd want it back. I stood up and tried to get his attention, but the train was already pulling out, and the doors had closed. I looked around for a second, thinking about running after him, but I didn't want to cause a scene. The guy didn't seem to notice, so I sat back down and put the backpack beside me. That's when things started to feel off. At first, it seemed like a harmless mistake. I figured I'd check the name tag or something to see if it belonged to anyone nearby. But when I opened it, there was no tag. No name. Just stuff. But not the usual stuff you'd expect. There were stacks of papers, mostly crumpled up and shoved into the bag. I tried not to look too closely at them, but there were a few that were half unfolded. And then I saw it. A photo, folded and half hidden under the papers. At first, I didn't know what I was looking at. It was a blurry shot, but enough to make my stomach turn. It was a picture of a group of men standing outside a building, all of them dressed in dark suits. I don't know why, but I felt a jolt of fear. It was like something in my gut told me I shouldn't be seeing this. I tried to push the feeling aside, but my curiosity got the better of me. I pulled the papers out, one by one, trying to make sense of them. Most of them were just legal-looking documents, nothing too strange. But there were a few that looked like blueprints, building layouts, designs for what looked like some kind of warehouse or facility. That's when I started to get scared. Why did this guy have this stuff? Why was it in a backpack, left behind on the train? I wanted to put it all back, leave the bag where I found it, but something was making me hold on to it. I didn't know what I was supposed to do with it. I thought about taking it to the lost and found, but the more I looked at the papers, the more I realized I didn't want to get involved. These were important documents, maybe even dangerous. I could feel my heart racing as I tried to figure out what to do. But then I saw the thing that made me freeze. There, At the very bottom of the bag was a small, black box. It wasn't big, but it felt heavy when I picked it up. I opened it cautiously, almost afraid to see what was inside. I don't know why I didn't just leave it, but I had to look. Inside the box was a small stack of cash, banded together with a rubber band. It was a lot of cash, thousands, easily. My hands were shaking as I closed the box, but I couldn't stop myself from looking at the papers again. There were names listed on some of them, people I didn't recognize. Some of the documents were stamped with red markings that looked official. It was like something straight out of a movie, a mix of government documents and criminal activity, right there in my lap. I didn't know what to think. I should have left it there, called the police, done something. But I didn't. I didn't know why, but I felt trapped, like I was already in too deep. The door to the train car opened, and I looked up, my heart pounding. For a second, I thought the guy who had left the bag behind might be coming back. But there was no one there. I stayed on the train, clutching the bag tightly. I told myself I'd just leave it at the next stop. But as the train kept moving, I started to realize just how much trouble I could be in. Whoever left this bag didn't just forget it. It was too important. I could feel my anxiety building, my mind racing with all the worst-case scenarios. Finally, I decided I couldn't keep it anymore. At the next stop, I got off the train and made my way to the exit. I was just about to drop the bag off in a trash bin when I felt a hand on my shoulder. I spun around, heart racing, and came face to face with a man I didn't recognize. He was tall, wearing dark sunglasses, and his voice was low, almost like a whisper. "You have something of mine," he said, his hand tightening on my shoulder. I couldn't speak. My mouth went dry, and all I could think about was how I had to get away. But I didn't know how. "You've got something that doesn't belong to you," he repeated, his tone sharper this time. He was looking at me with something like fury, and I could see the way his hand hovered near his waist, like he was waiting for something. I could feel the sweat on my palms as I held the bag tight, but I couldn't bring myself to give it back. I couldn't make any noise. It was like everything in me was telling me that if I did, something would happen, something bad. I don't know how long we stood there, but it felt like forever. The man didn't move, just kept staring at me. Finally, after what felt like hours, he stepped back, his face changing. "You're lucky," he said. "But don't ever do that again." And with that, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. I stood there for a moment, frozen, and then, without thinking, I ran. I didn't stop until I was home. I don't know what was in that bag, but I know it wasn't good. I'm sure it wasn't some innocent mistake. It felt like someone was watching me the whole time, like they knew what I had found. I haven't been able to stop thinking about it. I can't shake the feeling that I've crossed some line, and that the people who are looking for that bag will come for me. I haven't touched my phone since then, but I can't help but check the door every time I hear a noise. After what happened, I feel like I need to get it off my chest. I don't know who would believe me, but it's been on my mind for days now, and I can't shake the feeling that something is wrong. It was late, past midnight, maybe closer to 1 a.m., when I was driving home from a weekend trip. I'd been on the road for a few hours already, and I was starting to get tired, so I decided to stop for gas. I wasn't in a hurry, just needed to stretch my legs and get some caffeine before heading back out. The only station around for miles was this small, old place that seemed stuck in time, the kind of station that looked like it hadn't changed in years. The kind you see when you're driving on long, lonely stretches of highway. I pulled up to the pump, noticed that the lights were on, and there was one car parked near the front. It looked like the place was open, but the lights were a little dim, and everything felt quiet. Too quiet, I thought. I could barely hear the hum of the gas station sign, flickering in the dark. When I got out of my car, I saw the guy behind the counter through the small window in the station. He didn't wave or greet me like most attendants do. He just stared at me for a second. I thought it was odd, but I figured maybe he was just tired or not in the mood to chat. So, I just went ahead and started filling up my tank. That's when things started to feel off. I didn't think much of it at first, but as I was filling the gas tank, I noticed the guy hadn't moved. He was still standing behind the counter, watching me, just standing there. At first, I figured he was just waiting for me to finish. But when I glanced up, I noticed he was still staring, and it wasn't a casual glance, it was like he was waiting for something. After a few moments of feeling uncomfortable, I tried to shake it off. I just kept pumping gas, keeping my head down. But when I finished, I walked toward the door to pay, and that's when it got weird. The guy didn't come out. Instead, he just stayed behind the counter, looking at me without saying a word. I knocked on the window, feeling a little foolish, but thinking maybe he didn't hear me. He didn't move. I knocked again, a little louder this time, and finally, he turned around, not with a sense of urgency, but with a slow, deliberate motion. He seemed to take his time looking at me, almost like he was sizing me up. After what felt like an eternity, he finally walked over to the door and unlocked it, but he didn't open it fully. He just stepped aside, leaving a small gap. "Can I help you?" he asked. His voice was low and flat, like he was almost annoyed. "I just need to pay for the gas," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Sure," he replied, but instead of leading me to the register, he stepped back behind the counter, barely acknowledging me. His gaze didn't leave me, though. He watched me intently as I walked over to the register. As I stood there, about to pull out my wallet, I noticed something else. The door had a lock on it. I thought it was strange at first because I'd seen other customers walk in and out without it being locked. But now it was locked. I didn't think much of it at the time, but the thought lingered in the back of my mind. When I looked at the counter, I saw him glance at the door behind me and then back at me. There was this tension in the air, and it felt like it wasn't just the two of us in the building. I could feel that something was wrong, like I wasn't supposed to be there, and I was starting to get more and more uncomfortable. "Is something going on?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Why is the door locked?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he just took his time, pulling out the register drawer. He acted like my question hadn't even registered. When he finally looked up, he said, "Oh, just routine." I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I don't know why, but there was something in his voice, something in his eyes that didn't add up. It wasn't routine. It didn't feel like routine. Then, out of nowhere, the man said, "You should wait here for a moment." I didn't know what to say. I didn't want to cause trouble, but I had this gut feeling that he was keeping me there on purpose. It felt like he was stalling. Like he was waiting for something or someone. I started feeling like I was in the way, like I wasn't supposed to be there. I just need to get going," I said, my voice shaky now. "I'm in a bit of a hurry." But he didn't respond. He just kept looking at me. His gaze didn't waver. And that's when I heard it, something outside. A car pulling up in the parking lot. I didn't recognize the sound at first, but it didn't sound like a regular car. It was a large engine, and it idled loudly. I glanced toward the window, but the tinted glass made it impossible to see anything clearly. I heard a door slam outside, and then I saw the man's expression change. He didn't look at the window, but I could tell he knew exactly who had arrived. "Stay here," he said, almost urgently, as he turned toward the door. I felt a rush of adrenaline. I knew something wasn't right. I didn't know who was outside, but I felt trapped. I couldn't leave the station now. Not after hearing that engine and seeing the way the man was acting. He was no longer calm. His movements were quick and frantic, like he was trying to cover up something. I stood there frozen, watching him through the glass as he walked toward the back of the station. I don't know what happened next. I don't know why I didn't run right then, but I just stayed there. It was like my legs wouldn't move. I kept telling myself I needed to leave, but something was keeping me there, like I was stuck in the situation, unable to break free. After a few moments, the man came back, his face pale, but his posture was stiff and almost too controlled. "You should go," he said quickly, unlocking the door and stepping back to let me leave. I didn't need to be told twice. I practically ran out of there, jumping in my car and driving away without even looking back. I don't know if the person who had arrived was connected to what had just happened, but I felt a chill run through me. I didn't want to stay and find out. I still don't know exactly what happened at that station. I don't know who the guy was waiting for, or what would have happened if I hadn't left. But I know that something wasn't right. I can't shake the feeling that I almost got caught up in something dangerous that night. Every time I pass that gas station now, I can't help but feel like it's watching me, like someone is still waiting for me to come back. It started out so normal, I didn't think anything of it. I signed up for a gym membership about a month ago, nothing special. I wanted to get into better shape, and the gym was close to my work. At first, I was just going to the usual classes, you know, the group ones, where you don't have to talk to anyone. I was trying to be consistent, but I wasn't getting any personal training sessions. Then I met Jake. He was one of the trainers at the gym. He was friendly enough, introduced himself when I was finishing up on the treadmill one day. He didn't seem pushy, just casual. He asked me if I was interested in some personal training sessions, and I politely said no, that I was just here to get in shape. But Jake smiled and said he could help me with some exercises to get faster results. I told him I wasn't ready for that kind of commitment, but he didn't seem to take no for an answer. He kept asking if I was sure that I was wasting my time without a program, that I'd be frustrated if I didn't make progress soon. It was annoying, but not creepy, so I just told him I'd think about it and left the gym that day. Over the next couple of days, I started seeing him everywhere. I mean, it wasn't like I was avoiding him, but he started popping up in places where I didn't expect him. On the treadmill, on the machines, even by the weights. It was like he was following me around. It made me uncomfortable, but I tried to brush it off. I figured maybe he was just trying to be helpful. Then he started texting me. At first, it was just, "Hey, hope you're doing well," or "Saw you in the gym today, great work." It wasn't a big deal, but it felt strange, especially when it happened almost every day. I didn't know how to respond, so I would just reply with something neutral like "thanks" or "see you at the gym." But the messages kept coming, each one a little more personal. Like he was trying to get to know me, asking about what I do outside the gym, what my hobbies are, how my day went. It was odd, but I didn't think too much about it. Maybe he was just being friendly. One evening, after a long day at work, I decided to take a walk to clear my head. I hadn't been planning to go to the gym, but as I was walking down the street, I saw Jake. He was standing across the street, just standing there, looking at me. At first, I thought it was just a coincidence, but then he waved and crossed the street to talk to me. "Hey, I didn't know you'd be out here." "It's great to see you," he said with that overly bright smile of his. I tried not to show how surprised I was. It was just so strange, running into him outside of the gym. I didn't know what to say, so I just gave him a small smile and told him I was just taking a walk. Then he said something that made my heart skip a beat. "You know, I've been thinking. You'd be better off coming to the gym in the evenings. You seem more motivated when I'm around." I froze for a second. The way he said that made me feel like I was being watched. I tried to change the subject, saying I had to go home, but he kept walking alongside me, asking about my schedule and how I'd been doing. It felt like he was suddenly everywhere I went. And it wasn't just the gym. He started showing up at the coffee shop I went to in the mornings before work. One time, I walked into the store to grab a coffee, and he was sitting at one of the tables, sipping his drink and watching me. "I didn't know you liked this place," he said with that same smile. It was all too much. I started getting anxious every time I left my house, wondering if he'd be lurking somewhere. I had to stop replying to his texts, but he kept sending them. He'd ask things like, "Did you miss me at the gym?" or "I saw you walking down the street, everything okay?" It got worse when I tried to avoid him. I started skipping the gym or going at different times, hoping I could just get a break. But every time I showed up, he was there, watching me like he knew exactly where I'd be. Finally, I decided to do something about it. I wanted to quit the gym. I wasn't getting any enjoyment out of it anymore, and I couldn't shake the feeling that Jake was making me uncomfortable on purpose. I went to the front desk to cancel my membership. That's when Jake showed up. I hadn't seen him yet, but I could hear his voice from across the room as I talked to the receptionist. He walked up to me, and his voice suddenly sounded different, colder. "You're quitting?" he asked, his eyes narrowing just a bit. "Yeah," I said, trying to sound firm. "I've decided I don't need personal training anymore." "You don't need to quit," he said, his tone slipping into something a little more forceful. "I can help you. I've been doing a lot of research on your progress. We can work something out." I shook my head. "I'm not interested," I said. "I'm done." That's when he got closer, his voice dropping lower. "You can't just leave. Not after all this time." I was starting to feel trapped. The air between us grew tense, and I could feel the panic rising. I wanted to get out of there, but something in his eyes told me he wouldn't let me go so easily. He was standing too close now, almost blocking the door. "Jake," I said, trying to stay calm, "I'm done. Please let me leave." He didn't move. "You don't understand," he said, his voice sharp now. "I've been watching you. I've been helping you. You can't just walk away from me." The receptionist, thankfully, stepped in then, asking if everything was okay. It broke the tension just enough for me to get a moment to think. I quickly walked out of the gym, heart pounding in my chest. I don't know if he followed me, but I felt like I could never go back there again. It was like he knew everything about me, like he was tracking me every moment, waiting for me to slip up. I don't know what he wanted, but I knew I wasn't going to stick around long enough to find out. I canceled my membership for good, and I haven't been back since. But it still haunts me, the thought that someone could get that obsessed, that controlling, over something as simple as working out. I don't know if he'll ever leave me alone. I never expected to be in a situation like that. It all started a few weeks ago when I noticed a leak under the kitchen sink. It wasn't big, but enough for me to get worried. I called the building management to ask for a repair, figuring it would be an easy fix. The next day, I got a call from someone saying they were the plumbing service for the building and that someone would be over in an hour to take care of it. I'm usually careful with who I let into my apartment, but I didn't think much of it. The management had sent him, and I didn't see any reason not to trust them. So when a man showed up at my door around noon, I opened it without hesitation. He introduced himself as Mike and said he was here to fix the leak. He had a uniform on, which looked like the ones maintenance workers usually wear, so I assumed he was legit. He seemed friendly enough at first. He gave me a quick nod and went straight to the kitchen, where the leak was. "I'll just take a look, shouldn't take long," he said as he knelt down and started looking under the sink. I stood around for a while, just watching, trying to figure out what was wrong. I didn't have any real knowledge of plumbing, but everything seemed to be going fine. Then, after a few minutes of him working, he suddenly asked me, "So, what time do you usually leave for work?" It caught me off guard. It wasn't a weird question, but I wasn't sure why he was asking. I just shrugged it off and told him my work hours. He nodded and then said, "I'm just making sure I don't have to rush through things. It's all about getting it right, you know?" I smiled politely but felt a small twinge of discomfort. Maybe it was just me, but something about that question didn't sit right. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself I was overthinking things. About 10 minutes later, he stood up, wiped his hands on a rag, and looked at me. "You're lucky, the pipe was just a little loose. I'll tighten it, and it'll be fine." He moved to grab a wrench from his tool bag. That's when I noticed something strange. His bag didn't look like a standard plumbing tool kit. It was more like a heavy-duty duffel bag, almost too big to just be carrying tools. I wanted to ask about it, but didn't. I just told him I was glad it was nothing serious. He smiled, and for a second, I thought everything was fine. But then, he turned around and asked, "You live here alone?" This time, I couldn't hide the discomfort. I was starting to feel like this wasn't just about a pipe anymore. But I gave him a tight-lipped smile and nodded. "Yeah, just me." He paused, and for a second, I could have sworn I saw something flicker in his eyes, something almost predatory. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make my heart skip a beat. He cleared his throat. "I've got a few more things to check on, if you don't mind. Just to make sure everything's good." Now, I was really starting to get uneasy. This wasn't a huge apartment, and I didn't remember the building ever needing extra checks. But I didn't want to be rude, so I said, "Sure, go ahead." He moved from room to room, just checking random things, like the bathroom sink, the water heater in the utility closet, even the windows. I thought it was odd, but I kept telling myself it was part of the job. I stayed in the living room, my eyes flicking to the clock, wondering when he'd finish. When he finally came back to the living room, I felt relieved. Maybe too relieved. I was about to ask if he was done when he paused in front of the door. For a moment, I could see him glance around the room, as if he was scanning for something. Then he said, "I'll need to make sure the pipes in the basement are secure." "You don't mind, do you?" I froze. My building had an old basement, but I'd never heard of anyone needing to check the basement for a pipe issue before. I didn't know that was part of the job," I said, trying to sound casual, but I was already feeling something was wrong. He smiled again, but this time, it didn't feel friendly. "It's all part of the process, you know? It's best to do a full check." I didn't want to let him go down there alone. Something in my gut told me I shouldn't let him. But I didn't want to be confrontational, and I didn't want to seem rude. "Okay, "I'll just be right here," I said, standing up and following him to the door. He seemed surprised. "You don't need to come. I can handle it on my own." "I'll wait here, just in case," I replied, feeling more uneasy by the second. My heart was pounding. I didn't want to give him a chance to go down there alone. He seemed to consider it for a second before finally nodding. He opened the door to the hallway and motioned for me to follow. The stairs leading down to the basement were narrow and dark, and my footsteps echoed as we descended. I tried to make small talk, asking if he needed help carrying anything, but he was silent, focused. When we reached the basement, I noticed it wasn't just the pipes he was inspecting. The entire place seemed abandoned, bare, dark, and dusty. The air was thick with the smell of mildew. I stepped back, suddenly feeling even more uncomfortable. I didn't want to be down there with him. That's when I saw it. A small, black case on the far side of the room. It was tucked under a pile of old equipment, and my mind immediately flashed to the thought that it wasn't part of any plumbing tools I'd seen. It looked wrong. Mike bent down to it. He didn't even seem to notice I was staring at it, but my stomach turned. He opened it, and I saw what was inside. A series of things I couldn't make sense of at first: cables, wires, tools, and some kind of small handheld device that I couldn't identify. It looked like something you'd see in a crime show. I didn't know what it was, but I knew I didn't want to know. He glanced over his shoulder at me, and his eyes locked on mine. "It's just a part of the job," he said, his voice lower now, too quiet. "I think it's time for you to leave," I said, my voice shaking as I turned to head for the stairs. He didn't move, didn't say anything. But I felt his eyes on me, burning into my back as I quickly climbed back up the stairs, almost running. I didn't look back as I slammed the door shut behind me. I called building management and told them I didn't want anyone to come into my apartment ever again. I couldn't explain what had happened, but I knew it wasn't normal. I don't know who that man was or what he was really doing there. But the thought of what he might have been up to haunts me every day. I'm moving out as soon as I can. I never want to feel that trapped again. I don't know what he was planning, but I'm just glad I got out of there in one piece. I work in a big office downtown, just a regular 9-to-5 gig. It's not glamorous or anything, but it pays the bills. A few weeks ago, I had to stay late to finish some work. The office wasn't busy. Most people had gone home already, leaving just me and a few others working late. I was used to the quiet after hours. It had its own kind of rhythm. That night, I was in the middle of a big project, and it was already after 8 p.m. My manager was going to need the report first thing the next morning, so I had no choice but to push through. I was just focusing on the screen when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around, expecting maybe one of the other late stayers. Instead, it was Tom. He's someone I've seen around the office but never really spoke to much. He works in a different department, and we've only exchanged a few words in passing. He's quiet. Kind of strange, honestly. The type who keeps to himself but never quite fits in. "Hey," he said, standing by my desk. He seemed a little out of breath, and there was something odd in his eyes. I couldn't quite place it at first. "Hey, Tom," I replied. "What's up?" He didn't answer at first. He just looked around the room, almost like he was checking to see if anyone was still there. The office was empty except for us, so I figured maybe he was just being a little paranoid. "I thought you'd be gone by now," he said, still looking around. "It's late." I nodded. Yeah, I've got a report I need to finish. You staying late too? He didn't respond to that. Instead, he looked at me, his gaze too intense, like he was staring right through me. I wasn't sure what to make of it. It felt like I was in the room with someone I didn't know at all. Well, I guess I'll get back to work, I said, turning back to my screen. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I heard him take a few steps toward the door, then stop. You ever wonder if we're just stuck in here? He asked suddenly. I blinked. What do you mean? He didn't answer right away. His eyes were still darting around, and he looked like he was trying to figure something out in his head. I don't know. Just stuck. You know? Like we're all just waiting for something to happen. But it's never going to. The way he said it made my stomach tighten. There was something in his voice that didn't feel right. Like he wasn't just talking about work anymore. He was starting to sound almost paranoid. Yeah. I guess, I replied, unsure of what else to say. Look, I'm going to keep working. You need anything? No, he said quickly, a little too quickly. I'm fine. Just thinking. I nodded, trying to focus on my computer. But I couldn't stop thinking about what he'd said. There was something unsettling about it. Something about the way he was acting. I could feel the hair on the back of my neck stand up, and I tried to shake it off. About half an hour passed, and I was deep into my work again when I heard a loud click. The office lights flickered once and then went out completely, plunging the entire space into darkness. I froze. It was dead quiet. Too quiet. I looked around, trying to figure out if the power was out for the entire building or just the office. I fumbled around for my phone, hoping I'd at least have some light, but it wasn't there. I must have left it in my bag at the desk. My heart began to race. The silence was suffocating. Tom? I called out, my voice sounding small in the dark. No response. I stood up and started toward the door. I couldn't see anything, but I figured I could find my way to the emergency exit if I had to. But before I could reach the door, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me. I spun around, my breath caught in my throat. Tom? I said, my voice trembling a little more than I intended. He appeared out of the dark, standing a few feet away from me. His face was barely visible in the shadows, but I could see his eyes. His pupils were wide, and his expression was off. Like he was somewhere else, completely disconnected from reality. I told you we're stuck, he said, his voice almost a whisper. Stuck in this place. Tom, what's going on? Why are the lights off? I asked, taking a step back, trying to keep my voice calm. But I was starting to panic. He took a slow step toward me, and I could see his hands trembling slightly. His lips were pressed tight together. He didn't seem to hear me. Tom, what the hell? I said, more firmly this time, but he didn't respond. He just stared at me, his eyes a little too wide. There was something wrong with him. Something more than just him acting strange. I backed up against the wall, the panic rising in my chest. Tom, seriously, I need to get out of here. What's going on? He didn't answer. Instead, he started laughing. It wasn't a normal laugh, but more like a strange, unsettling chuckle that didn't match the situation at all. It felt like he wasn't laughing at something funny, but at some twisted thought in his head. I know what you're thinking, he said, still laughing quietly. You think I'm crazy, but I'm not. We're all stuck here. We're never getting out. You and me. just stuck. My heart was pounding in my chest. I didn't know what to do. "Tom, please," I said, trying to stay as calm as possible. "You need to let me go. I need to leave. Now." He stopped laughing abruptly and stared at me, his gaze sharp and intense. Then, in one swift motion, he lunged forward, grabbing my wrist with a vice-like grip. I gasped, trying to pull away, but he held on tight. "You're not going anywhere. We're all stuck here," he muttered, his breath hot on my skin. Panic shot through me, and I felt the blood rush to my head. I had to get away. My mind was racing, trying to figure out how to escape. I couldn't stay in this dark, empty office with him. With a burst of adrenaline, I wrenched my arm free from his grip. I didn't know how I did it, but I sprinted toward the door, my heart pounding so loudly I could hear it in my ears. I threw open the door, ran out into the hallway, and bolted toward the elevator. I didn't stop to look back, and I didn't wait for the elevator doors to close. I hit the button, and when they finally opened, I rushed inside, slamming my hand on the ground floor button. The elevator ride felt like it took forever. When the doors opened, I sprinted to the front entrance, threw open the door, and ran out into the night. I didn't stop until I was safely in my car, driving away. I don't know what happened to Tom after that, but I couldn't go back to that office for a while. I don't know what he was thinking, but I know I was lucky to get out of there. I haven't seen him since. It was just another Tuesday when the package arrived. I remember it clearly because I had just finished making dinner for my family. My daughter, Olivia, was sitting at the kitchen table doing her homework, and my husband, Brian, was still at work. The package was large and oddly shaped, wrapped in brown paper. It had my name on it, but it wasn't anything I recognized. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe it was something I ordered online and forgot about. I placed it on the counter, thinking I'd open it after dinner, but Olivia's curiosity got the better of her. "Mom, what's in the box?" she asked, standing up to get a closer look. "I'm not sure," I said. "I'll open it after we eat." But Olivia, being the way she was, couldn't wait. She had a way of convincing me to do things I wouldn't normally do. "I can't wait that long," she said, giving me that pleading look. "Can we open it now?" I sighed, chuckling. All right. Let's see what's inside." We cut the tape together, and as soon as the box opened, my heart skipped a beat. Inside were several smaller packages wrapped in plastic, but what caught my attention immediately was a metal box inside it all. It looked official, almost like something you'd expect to see in a government office. The type that has a lock and a key. "Mom, what is that?" Olivia asked, her voice higher now, probably noticing how I froze. I looked at the metal box, trying to calm myself. I had no idea what it was. The packaging didn't give any clues. No return address, no note, nothing. Just that weird, locked box. I stood there for a few seconds, trying to collect myself, trying to figure out whether I should open it or not. But my gut told me something wasn't right. I grabbed my phone and called Brian. It was already late, so I was a little worried he wouldn't pick up, but luckily he did. "Hey, what's up?" he answered, sounding tired. "There's a package here for me," I said, keeping my voice low, though I wasn't sure why. "I don't know where it came from, and it's weird. There's this metal box inside." "What's in it?" he asked, his tone now more alert. I haven't opened it yet, I said, trying to keep calm. I think I should wait until you get home. Don't open it, he said, his voice sharp. I'll be there in about 20 minutes. Just wait, okay? I agreed and hung up. But that didn't stop me from feeling uneasy. Olivia kept asking questions, but I couldn't give her any answers. We just sat there in silence, staring at the box until Brian came home. When he arrived, he immediately walked over to the counter and took the box. He didn't ask any questions. Just grabbed it, took it to the kitchen table, and started inspecting it closely. I stood there, watching him, my anxiety rising by the second. He tried to open the metal box, but it was locked tight. There was no key, no way to open it without some kind of tool. Do you think it's a mistake? I asked, trying to make sense of it all. Maybe it's for someone else. Brian didn't answer. He just kept looking at the box. Then, without saying anything, he picked up his phone and dialed a number. I couldn't hear the conversation, but I could tell from the look on his face that he wasn't happy. After he hung up, he looked at me, his eyes serious. Someone's going to be here soon, he said quietly. We need to stay calm. Don't talk to anyone. Do you understand? I nodded, too scared to ask any more questions. Olivia was standing by the door, looking at us, not fully understanding what was going on. The next few minutes felt like hours, as Brian and I just stood there, waiting. Then, the doorbell rang. Brian moved quickly, shutting the kitchen door behind him and signaling me to stay quiet. I did as I was told, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear muffled voices at the door, but I couldn't make out the words. After a few seconds, I heard the front door open. Where is it? A man's voice asked. I didn't recognize it. Brian's voice was calm but firm. It's here, he said. You need to explain what this is. The man didn't respond. Instead, I heard the sound of footsteps moving through the house, then a heavy knock on the kitchen door. I could feel my pulse racing as Brian opened the door. There were two men standing in the hallway. One was older, maybe in his late 40s, with a scar running across his face. The other was younger, probably in his late 20s, wearing a hoodie. They didn't seem threatening at first, but something about their presence made me uneasy. Is this the box? The older man asked, his eyes narrowing as he looked at Brian. Brian nodded, his voice steady. Yes. Now, explain why it was sent to my house. The younger man stepped forward, glancing over his shoulder at the older one. We made a mistake, he said, his voice shaky. It wasn't meant for you. You weren't supposed to get it. My stomach dropped. I could feel the air growing thicker, the tension rising. What's inside the box? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The older man gave me a sharp look, then turned back to Brian. We need to get it back. It's important. And we can't leave until we do. Brian stood firm, not letting them pass. I could see the look on his face. He wasn't going to let them intimidate us. But that didn't make me feel any better. It only made me more nervous, because I had no idea what we were dealing with. The younger man stepped forward again, his hand shaking. We don't want any trouble. Just give us the box, and we'll leave. We're not here to hurt anyone. But something in his eyes told me that wasn't true. They weren't here for a simple mistake. I knew it. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach. Brian took a deep breath, then slowly walked toward the box. He handed it over without a word. The older man gave a small nod. Thanks, he said, and that's when the younger one quickly turned to leave, as if in a hurry. They both left without another word, but I could still feel the tension hanging in the air long after the door closed behind them. We didn't speak for a long time after that. I don't know what was in that box, but I don't think I want to know. I just know that whatever it was dangerous. We were lucky. If Brian hadn't been so quick to call them, I don't think it would have ended well. After they left, we locked all the doors and checked every window. I didn't sleep that night, and neither did Brian. Olivia asked about the box a few times, but we told her it was nothing, just a mistake. I don't know if she believed us, but I didn't want to scare her. A part of me wonders if we'll ever hear from those men again, or if it was all just a warning. I don't know if they'll come back, but I won't forget the fear I felt that night. It was real. It started on a Tuesday evening when my dog, Scout, didn't come home. He'd always been the kind of dog to come when called, even if he was busy sniffing something in the yard. But that evening, after calling for him for over an hour, I started to feel that tight, anxious feeling in my chest. I'm not one to panic easily, but this was different. Scout never stayed out that late. I walked around the neighborhood, knocking on doors, asking if anyone had seen him. No one had. By the time it was dark, I was desperate. I put on a jacket, grabbed a flashlight, and went to the park where Scout loved to run. I didn't know what I was hoping for, maybe just to find him sitting at the park gates like he had done so many times before. But when I walked through the park, calling his name, all I could hear was the wind and the occasional rustle of leaves. Nothing. I don't know why, but I had this strange feeling that something was wrong. Maybe it was because I couldn't find him anywhere. Maybe it was because it felt like he had just vanished. When I got back to my house, I started going through all the possible places he might have gone. But the more I thought about it, the more something felt off. I posted on local Facebook groups, hoping someone might have seen him. And that's when I got the message. It was from a woman named Janet who said she thought she had seen a dog like Scout near the old industrial building on the edge of town. I didn't know what to think at first. That building had been abandoned for years. No one ever went there. It was dangerous, really. But I was desperate. I didn't think twice. The next morning, I drove out there. The building sat alone, hidden behind thick trees, its rusted exterior barely visible from the road. It was one of those places you drive by and never give a second thought. Old, crumbling, completely forgotten. The windows were boarded up, and the front door hung open slightly. I stopped the car a good distance away and took a deep breath before I got out. I grabbed a leash, hoping I'd find Scout and that he'd be excited to see me, but my heart was already pounding in my chest. Something felt wrong about this place, like the air itself was heavier than usual. But I couldn't just leave. I had to find him. I walked toward the building, calling Scout's name. The wind carried my voice, but there was no response. The place was eerily quiet. As I got closer to the door, I felt that sense of unease grow stronger. There was no sound, no movement. Just the oppressive silence. I stepped inside cautiously, shining my flashlight around the dark space. It looked like a warehouse, with piles of old crates and debris scattered across the floor. The air smelled musty, like mold and rot. I called out again, louder this time. Scout. I shouted. Scout. Nothing. Just the echo of my own voice. I took a few more steps inside, the floor creaking beneath me, careful not to step on anything that might make a noise. That's when I heard something. a faint scratching sound coming from the back of the building. My heart skipped a beat. "Scout," I whispered. My voice trembled. I slowly moved toward the sound, my flashlight shaking in my hand. As I rounded a corner, I saw it. A cage. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but no, it was there. A small metal cage, its bars covered in dust. My stomach churned as I moved closer. And then I saw what was inside. A dog. Not Scout, but a dog I recognized from one of the neighborhood posters. I froze. My mind raced as I tried to process what I was seeing. The dog was clearly malnourished, its eyes wide and frantic. It whined softly, its body trembling in fear. But that wasn't what made my blood run cold. No, it was the man standing next to the cage. He was tall, his face hidden in shadows, but I could see enough to know he was watching me. He had a look on his face that I couldn't place, calm, almost too calm, like he'd been waiting for me. "Looking for your dog, are you?" he said, his voice low, almost amused. I took a step back, my mind spinning. What are you doing with these dogs?" I demanded, my voice shaky but forceful. The man didn't answer right away. He just stared at me, and then he took a step toward me. I could see his hands now, calloused and covered in dirt, like he'd been working. "You're not the first one," he said, his voice almost too soft. "They always come looking for their pets, but they never leave the same way they came in." I felt my heart drop to my stomach. I didn't know what he meant, but I knew I didn't want to find out. "Where's my dog?" I asked, trying to sound braver than I felt. My hand gripped the flashlight like a weapon, though I knew it wouldn't do much if he decided to make a move. He smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile that made your skin crawl. "He's close," the man said. "But you'll need to come with me if you want him back." My brain was screaming at me to run, but my feet wouldn't move. I stayed frozen in place, staring at him. My thoughts were racing, trying to think of an escape plan. But I didn't have one. Not yet. Without saying another word, the man turned and walked deeper into the building, disappearing into the shadows. I knew I should leave, that this was a bad situation, but the thought of Scout being somewhere in this building, possibly hurt or worse, made it impossible to turn back. I followed him, trying to stay as quiet as possible, but every step felt like a mistake. The further I went, the darker it got, until I was relying entirely on the beam of my flashlight. Then, I heard voices, low, murmuring voices. Panic hit me like a wave. I ducked behind a stack of crates and peeked around the corner. There were more people. 3 of them, sitting in a circle, their faces obscured by the darkness. And in the middle of that circle was something else, a pile of something. Bags, maybe. I couldn't tell for sure, but it didn't matter. What mattered was that Scout wasn't there. The man I'd been following stood at the entrance to the room, watching me intently. I turned and ran. I didn't think. I just ran. I didn't stop until I was back in my car, panting, shaking all over. My hands were so stiff I could barely grip the steering wheel. But I couldn't leave the area without knowing if Scout was still here. I waited until I saw a few more cars pull up to the building, each one carrying more people I didn't recognize. I called the police from my car, not daring to go back into that building. By the time they arrived, I had already driven back to town. They went inside and found more dogs, all in cages. Some of them were injured, others in too much shock to move. They said there had been signs of illegal activity happening there for months. They were just waiting for the right moment to make an arrest. The whole thing still doesn't sit right with me. I found Scout 2 days later. He was shaken, but he was alive. And though I can't ever explain why I didn't trust my instincts sooner, I know one thing for sure: there are people out there who don't just want to hurt animals. They want to hurt us, too. I never thought much about the house at the end of the driveway. It's an old, one-story place that's been there for as long as I can remember. It's always been quiet, just the sound of leaves blowing through the trees or the occasional distant car passing by. But that all changed about 2 weeks ago, right around the time I noticed a car parked at the end of my driveway. It wasn't much at first, a nondescript sedan, just sitting there, headlights off, engine off, not doing anything at all. I didn't think anything of it. Maybe someone was lost, or maybe it was a neighbor coming to visit a friend. But then it happened again the next night. And the night after that. I found it hard to ignore after a while. The car was always there, parked in the same spot, always just far enough down the driveway that I couldn't see the driver's face, but I knew someone was sitting in it. I tried not to think too much about it, but I'd catch myself staring out the window, watching it sit there in the dark, and something about it just felt wrong. Like it was waiting for something. At first, I didn't say anything to my wife. She's always been the type to brush things off, and I didn't want to worry her. But one evening, when I got home from work, I decided to mention it. "There's a car parked at the end of the driveway every night," I said, trying to sound casual, even though my stomach was already in knots. "I think it's someone just passing through." She didn't seem too concerned. "Maybe it's one of the neighbors," she said, dismissing it with a wave of her hand. "You're overthinking it." That was that, and I tried to move on. But something gnawed at me. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching. I didn't know who or why, but I kept feeling like I wasn't alone when I was home. Like I was being observed from just outside the window. After a few more nights of seeing the car parked there, I decided to do something about it. The next evening, I took a walk down the driveway. I walked slowly, just in case the driver was still there, but as I got closer to the spot where the car usually sat, it was gone. I felt a little relieved, but the sense of unease didn't completely fade. Then came the weird part. The next morning, I went to check the mailbox, and there was a small, folded piece of paper stuffed in the slot. It wasn't anything I recognized, no name or address, just a plain white sheet of paper with a single message on it: "I see you." My blood went cold. The handwriting wasn't neat or neat enough to make out much, but it was a jagged scrawl, like someone had written it in a hurry, maybe even angrily. I stood there in the driveway for a long time, just staring at the paper, trying to make sense of it. Who would do this? And why? I went back inside, and I showed my wife, trying to laugh it off. "Probably just a prank," I said, forcing a chuckle. "Some kid trying to freak me out." She gave me a skeptical look but didn't say anything. I don't think she fully understood how much it rattled me. Over the next couple of days, things got worse. The car showed up again, parked in its usual spot. Every night. I started staying up late, just watching it, trying to catch a glimpse of the driver, trying to figure out who the hell was behind it. But every time I check, the car would be empty. Always empty. Just sitting there. The worst part came a few days after the note. I was working from home, sitting at the kitchen table, when I saw something through the window. A shadow. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was standing just out of view, watching me. I quickly got up and moved to the window, trying not to draw attention to myself. I peered out, and that's when I saw it. The car. But this time, it wasn't sitting idle. Someone was in it, sitting in the driver's seat, their face just barely visible through the tinted windows. I couldn't make out any details, just the faint outline of a figure, their head turned toward my house. Watching. My heart started pounding. I didn't know what to do. Should I call the police? Confront them? But I didn't know who it was or what they wanted. I didn't know if I was overreacting, but it felt so real. So dangerous. I stayed frozen for what felt like hours, watching the car, praying it would drive away. But it didn't. It just sat there, motionless, with the driver staring at my house. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my phone, ready to dial the police, when I saw something that made my stomach drop. In the reflection of the window, I saw the faint outline of a figure in my yard. My blood ran cold. It wasn't a shadow this time. It was someone standing outside, right at the edge of the yard, just past the tree line. I couldn't see their face, but I could tell they were looking directly at me. I panicked. I hung up the phone without calling anyone and ran for the back door, but just before I could open it, the doorbell rang. The sound was loud, sharp, and it made me jump out of my skin. I felt like I was suffocating. My heart was racing so fast I thought it might explode. I looked through the peephole, and for a moment, I didn't see anyone. I opened the door a crack, just enough to peer outside, but there was nothing there. Just the front steps, the empty driveway, and that damned car still parked at the end of the driveway. I didn't know who or what was out there, but I wasn't sticking around to find out. I grabbed my phone again and this time called the police. I didn't care what they thought of me. I didn't care if they thought I was paranoid. I needed help. When they arrived, they checked the area, and sure enough, they found fresh tire tracks in the dirt behind the car, leading up to the back of the house, almost as if someone had been driving around my property in the middle of the night. They didn't find anyone, but the police made sure to document everything. They told me to stay alert, lock my doors, and let them know if anything unusual happened. That night, I barely slept. The car was still there, parked just far enough down the driveway to make me nervous. But I couldn't bring myself to go out and confront whoever it was. I stayed in the house, keeping the lights off, trying to ignore the creeping feeling that someone was always watching. The next morning, the car was gone. I haven't seen it since, but I still feel that same sense of dread whenever I step outside. I check the driveway every day, just in case. And I can't shake the feeling that whoever was watching me, whoever left that note, is still out there. Somewhere. Waiting. I've been working at this office for almost a year now. It's a small company, only about 20 of us, and it's pretty quiet most of the time. People come in, do their work, leave, nothing too exciting. But something happened a few weeks ago that has stuck with me and is still haunting me. It started on a Tuesday morning. I was sitting at my desk, scrolling through emails when I realized that Natalie wasn't at her desk. She's the one I sit closest to, and we usually say hi when we arrive in the morning. But that day, nothing. I didn't think much of it at first. She could have been running late or had an early appointment. I didn't think to check in on her right away. We all had our routines, and I figured I'd see her at some point in the day. But as the hours dragged on, I started to notice that no one seemed to know where she was. By lunch, she still hadn't shown up. I asked a few people if they had seen her, and no one had. One of the other girls, Monica, mentioned she hadn't seen Natalie either and said it was odd because she was usually pretty punctual. I agreed. Natalie was one of those people who was always on time, always at her desk first thing. It wasn't like her to just not show up. I decided to check in on her. It was around 2 p.m. when I thought maybe I should call her. I wasn't sure if I should call or just wait it out, but something in me pushed to pick up the phone. I dialed her number and let it ring. It went to voicemail. That wasn't a huge surprise. Maybe she was in a meeting or something. I didn't think much of it. But then, I thought I should check her office to see if she left something behind or if maybe she had slipped out without telling anyone. I stood up and made my way over to her desk. When I got there, everything seemed fine at first glance. Her chair was pushed in, her computer was on but locked, and there were some papers neatly stacked on her desk. But then, I noticed something strange. Her jacket, the one she always left hanging behind her chair, was gone. It was a small thing, but it struck me as odd. She never took it home, she would just leave it there, like a part of her routine. I wasn't sure what to think of that. I looked around for anything else unusual, but I didn't find anything. There were no signs of a struggle or anything out of the ordinary. Still, something didn't sit right with me, so I decided to head down to the break room and ask if anyone had heard from her. Maybe someone had seen her that morning or knew where she had gone. When I got to the break room, I ran into James, one of the senior guys. He looked just as puzzled as I was. "Hey, have you seen Natalie today?" I asked him. He shook his head. "No, she wasn't at the meeting this morning, and I haven't heard anything from her since then." That was the first real alarm bell. We had all been in the meeting that morning, and I was pretty sure she had been there. I couldn't remember exactly what had happened during the meeting, but I could have sworn she was there. I was starting to feel uneasy. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but at that point, I felt like I needed to find out what happened. I went back to her desk, sat down in her chair, and checked her computer. It felt wrong, but I wasn't sure what else to do. I opened her email inbox and looked for anything that might explain her absence. There were no strange emails, nothing out of the ordinary, just the usual work-related stuff. That's when I remembered something. The night before, I had worked late, and I was the last person to leave. I vaguely remembered seeing Natalie by the elevator when I was heading out. I had stopped and said goodbye, but I didn't notice if she was waiting for someone or if she had left with anyone. I tried to remember more details, but everything about that night felt blurry now. Maybe it was because I was so tired. But what if something had happened then? I decided to go back to my desk and sit with the thought for a minute. I checked the time again. It was nearly 3 p.m. now. Where could she be? Why hadn't anyone heard from her? I figured I'd call the police, just to be sure. But before I could make that call, my phone buzzed. It was a text from her. It just said, "Can you help me? Please." I froze. The message wasn't like her at all. She was never the type to ask for help in such a vague way. And the timing was strange. She hadn't texted me all day, and now, out of nowhere, this? I felt my stomach drop. I tried to text her back, asking where she was, what was going on. But the text didn't go through. It just sat there, saying delivered, but no reply. I tried calling her again. Nothing. I started to panic. Where was she? Why wasn't she responding? By this point, I had already contacted a couple of people at work, and the consensus was the same: no one had seen her, and no one knew where she was. I decided to call her apartment building. Maybe they could tell me if she had been in or out that day. The receptionist told me that she hadn't seen Natalie that day at all, which was strange because Natalie was almost always there, especially during the work week. I started to feel like I was losing control of the situation. Everything seemed so wrong. Something wasn't adding up. That's when I got a message on my work phone. It was an email from Natalie's account. The subject line read, "I need you to stop looking for me." I opened it quickly, my heart pounding, and I read, "You were the last one to see me. Now you need to stay away." I felt the blood drain from my face. The email was short, direct, and completely chilling. It didn't make sense. Was it really her sending this? Was someone pretending to be her? Or worse, was someone manipulating her, and now they were warning me to stop looking? I didn't know what to do anymore. I immediately called the police. I didn't care if it was overreacting. I couldn't let it go. I couldn't ignore the feeling in my gut telling me something had happened to her. They took it seriously, especially after I mentioned the strange messages and her odd behavior lately. It didn't take long for the police to find out more. A few hours later, they found out that Natalie had been seen leaving her apartment with someone late the previous evening. The person was someone none of us recognized. There was no record of them in the office, no connection, nothing. But they had footage of them together, walking away from her building. I tried not to feel too hopeful, but I couldn't help but think she might be okay. Eventually, I got a call. They found her. She was alive, but she had been scared. Apparently, she had gotten into some kind of trouble with a man she had met recently. They weren't sure what had happened, but he had been stalking her. And the worst part? He'd been following her into work for days before anything started happening. It all felt so surreal. I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't gone looking for her. If I hadn't been the last person to see her. It's been a few weeks since all of this, and Natalie's back at work now. But she's different. More guarded. More distant. And I can't shake the feeling that I'm not the only one who knows she's been through something terrible. Something that won't be easy to forget. I still don't know the full truth about everything that happened. But I do know one thing for sure. I'll never ignore a feeling in my gut again. I wasn't planning on stopping. I had been driving for hours, the road ahead stretching out endlessly. But when I saw the patch of wildflowers by the side of the road, I couldn't resist. I had always loved wildflowers, and this was a spot with a mix of colors, bright yellows, delicate purples, and some white ones I couldn't name. It seemed so peaceful there, like a moment of calm in the middle of nowhere. I pulled off the road, careful to park just out of sight from the few cars that passed by. There was no real shoulder, just a dirt patch where the grass grew tall. The sun was starting to dip, casting a golden hue over everything. I stepped out of the car and took a deep breath of the cool air. It felt good to stretch my legs after the long drive. The flowers were just a few yards into the trees. As I moved deeper into the brush, the quiet was almost suffocating. The only sound was the rustling of leaves under my feet. I bent down, carefully picking a few of the flowers, when something caught my movement just beyond the trees. It wasn't much at first, just a faint outline of what looked like a tent. I figured someone else was camping, but it seemed odd. There wasn't a proper campsite nearby. No established area, no fire ring, just a tent tucked behind some bushes, half hidden from the road. I should have just left it alone, but curiosity got the better of me. I wanted to see what it was. Maybe I could ask the people there if they knew anything about the flowers, or if they had a spare match, something harmless, I thought. I walked toward the tent, careful to make no noise. As I got closer, I noticed a few things that made me pause. First, there was no sound. No voices. No laughter. Nothing. The area seemed unnervingly still. I stepped closer. The tent was old, worn down, and looked like it had been there for a while. The flap was open just enough for me to peek inside. I hesitated. Something didn't feel right, but I pushed the feeling aside. I'd come this far. I crouched by the flap and peeked in. The inside of the tent was a mess, clothes scattered across the floor, a sleeping bag crumpled up in the corner. But what caught my attention immediately was the large stain on the ground near the center. Dark and almost black, like something had been spilled, or worse. I couldn't make out what it was, but the thought that it might be blood made my stomach tighten. I stepped back, my pulse quickening. I was about to turn away when something on the ground outside caught my eye. A small, tarnished metal object glinted in the light. I knelt down to pick it up, and when I held it in my hand, I realized it was a knife. A small, sharp-looking blade, but it had been dropped carelessly on the dirt, as if someone had left it in a hurry. I dropped it almost immediately, as if the object itself had burned me. A sense of dread started to creep in. That's when I noticed something else, scratches, deep and uneven, on the tree nearest the tent. It didn't look natural. They were too jagged, like something had been dragged or pulled against the bark. I took a few steps closer, and my breath hitched when I noticed something on the ground. There were scuff marks, deep and large, as if someone had been dragged through the dirt, and the path led toward the edge of the forest, toward the trees where the path faded into the shadows. I stood there for a moment, trying to process what I was seeing. It felt like a weight had settled on my chest. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it, but the more I thought, the more I started to panic. This wasn't just some regular campsite. This wasn't a peaceful place for people to rest. I started backing away, my eyes darting to the trees, the tent, the knife. I had to get out of there. Then I heard a noise. A twig snapped behind me. I spun around, heart leaping into my throat. Nothing. Just the wind. I stood there frozen for what felt like an eternity. My mind was running wild. Should I go back to the car? Should I call someone? I couldn't decide, but my legs were already moving. My body was reacting before I could even think. I ran back toward the road, my feet slipping on the loose dirt. As I broke through the trees, I nearly tripped over a root. I didn't stop to catch my breath. I didn't care if I was making noise anymore. I just had to get back to my car, back to safety. The whole time, I kept hearing noises behind me. Branches snapping, footsteps that didn't belong to me. I was almost at the car when I heard it. A low, guttural voice from the trees. "Hey, you." I froze. My blood ran cold. I didn't look back. I didn't want to know who it was or why they were talking to me. My mind raced. I was so close, but I wasn't sure if I was going to make it. I reached the driver's side door, fumbling with the handle. My hands were shaking so badly I couldn't get it open at first. "Hey." I said, "Hey." I was in the car now, slamming the door shut and locking it before I even started the engine. My hands were still shaking, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might break through my chest. I glanced into the rearview mirror. No one. There was nothing. Just the empty road behind me, and the trees swaying gently in the wind. I pulled out of there faster than I'd ever driven in my life. I didn't care about the speed limit. I didn't care about anything except getting away from that place. I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't gone. Maybe it was nothing. just some weird coincidence. But I can't shake the feeling that I saw something that wasn't meant to be seen. And the worst part is, I don't know who that voice belonged to, or what they were doing out there. I haven't told anyone about it. It feels too strange, too surreal to explain. But every time I pass by that stretch of road now, my heart races. I wonder if the tent is still there, if anyone's still out there. I can't shake the image of the knife, the stain, the scuff marks leading into the trees, and the voice. Always the voice. It's like it's following me, even though I know it's not. It was supposed to be an easy night. I worked the late shift at the bank, and I was the last one in. My job was simple: check the accounts, close up, and make sure everything was secure for the night. No different from any other day. Around 9 p.m., I finished my work and started the usual closing routine. The vault had to be locked, which was always the last thing I did before heading out. It's a big vault, one of those heavy metal doors with a combination lock. I always felt a bit nervous when I turned the dial, but it was part of the job. It was the sound of that door closing that reminded me everything was secure. That night, the bank was empty, and everything seemed normal. I wasn't expecting any issues. But when I went to leave, I couldn't get the door open. I tried turning the handle. Nothing. I figured the lock had jammed or something, so I tried again. And again. But the door wouldn't budge. I hit the emergency release button, just in case, but it didn't do anything. Panic started to creep in. The vault door was solid, and I was trapped inside. No phone, no way to contact anyone. It's one of those places where the signal doesn't reach in the vault, and I had left my phone upstairs with my coat. I should have grabbed it before locking up, but I didn't. I started to get more anxious. I tried pulling on the handle harder, thinking it might give, but it wouldn't move. I looked around, desperate to figure out what was wrong. The small light above me flickered, casting long shadows across the vault. I had no idea how long I was going to be stuck here. Minutes passed, and I had no idea how much time had gone by. I kept looking at the clock on the wall. It was almost 9:30, and I was getting worried. The other employees were supposed to leave earlier, so I was all alone by this point. I tried to stay calm, but my heart was racing. The panic was starting to build up in my chest. What if no one realized I was stuck? What if I was trapped in here until morning? I pressed the emergency button again. Nothing. The alarm should have gone off by now, I thought. The system was supposed to trigger an alert if anyone was locked inside after hours. But nothing had happened. There was no sound, no alarm. It was like the system wasn't even working. The silence felt heavy, almost suffocating. I kept telling myself that someone would come to help, but the longer I sat there, the more it felt like I was being forgotten. I began pacing around the vault, running my hands over the cold metal walls. I thought about how to break out, but there was nothing I could do. The walls were solid, and the door, no matter how much I twisted and pulled, wouldn't open. The minutes seemed to drag on forever. I was starting to feel claustrophobic, my breathing shallow. I could hear my own heartbeat in the silence, and the sound of the clock ticking echoed through the vault like it was counting down. It wasn't until I glanced up at the clock that I realized how much time had passed. It was almost 10 o'clock. Someone should have noticed by now, right? Why hadn't anyone come? Why hadn't the alarm gone off? The panic in my chest was turning into dread. Something was wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I walked back to the door and tried pulling again, harder this time, hoping that maybe with more force it would give. But it didn't. I looked around again, feeling more trapped by the second. My mind raced, trying to figure out what to do, but the more I thought, the more the darkness of the vault seemed to close in on me. I had no idea what time it was now. I was starting to think I might never get out when I heard the sound of footsteps echoing through the building. Someone was coming. I felt a sudden rush of relief, but also confusion. Who would be here at this hour? I had never been in this situation before, and I didn't know what to expect. I stood still, listening. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, like they knew exactly where they were going. My heart was pounding again. Was it one of the employees? Was someone coming to check the vault? Maybe someone finally noticed I was still here. But then I heard the door upstairs open. And then a voice. It was muffled, but I could make out words. I couldn't quite hear it all, but I caught something about getting rid of the evidence and before the cops show up. My heart skipped a beat. I knew I was in trouble now. The footsteps were closer. Whoever it was wasn't coming to help me. They were coming to cover something up. I had no idea what it was, but I could feel it. I could sense it. I rushed back to the vault door and tried again to get it open, but it was useless. I had to get out, but I didn't know how. My pulse was racing, and I was starting to hyperventilate. I felt trapped, helpless. Whoever was coming didn't sound like they were in any hurry to leave. The sound of keys jingling reached my ears, and the door to the vault creaked open. The man standing there wasn't anyone I recognized. He was dressed in a black hoodie and jeans, his face obscured by a mask. I froze. My instinct screamed at me to run, but I was paralyzed by fear. "Thought you might be in here," he said in a low voice, as he stepped inside. I tried to back away, but there was nowhere to go. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice trembling. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he moved closer, his eyes never leaving mine. I was shaking, unsure of what he intended to do. There was no escape, no way out. I thought I was done for. But then, the man sighed and took a step back. "I'm not here to hurt you," he muttered. "Just don't make a sound." I stayed as still as possible, watching him carefully. He was fidgeting with something in his hands, a set of documents, I realized. He looked at the vault and then back at me. His face was hidden behind the mask, but his body language told me everything. He wasn't here for anything good. He seemed to think for a moment, as if weighing his options, and then motioned for me to stay quiet. He slipped out of the vault, and I heard the door shut behind him. My chest was tight, my mind racing with all the possibilities of what might be going on. I waited for what felt like an eternity. The silence was almost unbearable. I wanted to scream, to make noise, but I knew better. I had to stay quiet. Whatever was happening, I couldn't be part of it. Eventually, I heard the man's footsteps again. This time, they were fading away, getting quieter. I dared to take a deep breath. I wasn't sure how long it had been since he'd left, but I knew I couldn't stay here any longer. I had to get out, to warn someone. When I finally managed to get the door open, I rushed out of the vault, my heart racing. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see what might be waiting for me. The hallway was empty, but I didn't stop to check. I ran straight for the back door, where I was sure no one would be watching. I made it outside, breathless, and I didn't stop running until I was safely in my car. I don't know what they were doing in that vault, but I can't shake the feeling that I barely escaped whatever crime they were trying to cover up. It still haunts me every night, wondering if I made it out in time. It started out as a perfect day. My girlfriend and I had been talking about renting a boat for a while, and after a stressful few months of work and life, we figured it would be nice to have some time to ourselves. We found a small, secluded lake just outside of town. The kind of place where the water was calm, surrounded by trees and the occasional bird call. It was a Friday morning, early enough that we figured there would be no one else around. We rented a small rowboat from a little shack by the shore and set off, ready to enjoy the peace and quiet. The boat was small, just enough for the two of us, and we had everything we needed: a picnic, some drinks, and a blanket. The weather was perfect, sunny, but not too hot. There wasn't a single cloud in the sky. I rowed while my girlfriend sat at the front, her feet dangling over the edge, dipping into the cool water. It felt like we were the only people in the world. We rowed out toward the middle of the lake, not really having any specific destination in mind. We were just enjoying the calm, the quiet, the isolation. There wasn't even a sound from the shore. The lake was so still that it almost felt unreal, like we were in a bubble. After a while, we stopped and let the boat drift for a bit, enjoying the moment. We talked about our plans for the future, silly things, nothing important. Everything felt light and easy. That's when we noticed the other boat. At first, it wasn't anything out of the ordinary. Just another small boat drifting near the center of the lake. But when we looked closer, something felt off. It wasn't moving, even though there was a slight breeze, and it seemed to be sitting unnaturally still. I couldn't see anyone in it. There were no oars, no sign of life. Just an empty boat floating in the middle of nowhere. My girlfriend pointed it out first, her voice quiet. "Is that someone's boat?" she asked. I squinted, trying to make sense of it. "I don't know. It doesn't look right." We both stared at it for a few more moments. Something about the boat made me uneasy. It was just drifting there, too still. We had been out for a while, and by then, I should have been able to see some movement, some sign of someone rowing or adjusting the boat. But there was nothing. I tried to shrug it off. It was probably just some forgotten boat. I started to row toward it, mostly out of curiosity. I didn't know why, but I felt like we needed to check it out. Maybe it had been abandoned, maybe it had drifted off course, and someone had gone for help. It seemed harmless enough, and I figured we'd just take a quick look and then continue with our day. As we got closer, I could see more clearly. The boat was a small, old-fashioned wooden rowboat, the kind that looked like it had been sitting around for years. It was weathered, a bit rough around the edges, but it seemed sturdy enough. But there was something I hadn't expected. The boat was covered in blood stains. At first, I thought it was some kind of mistake, just a few red patches on the floor of the boat. But as we got closer, I saw it more clearly. The blood was smeared across the seat, soaking into the wood. The stains were fresh, still wet in some places. It was as if someone had been bleeding in there recently, and then just left it. There was more blood than I could make sense of. It was all over the seat, splattered against the sides. My stomach turned, and I immediately felt sick. My girlfriend was silent, her eyes wide as she stared at the blood. I could see her shivering, even though the air was warm. "What the hell happened here?" she whispered. "I didn't know." I felt a knot in my chest. Part of me wanted to turn back and forget about it, but another part of me, the part that should have known better, felt like we had to investigate. It wasn't like I was in danger, I didn't think we were. But the blood, the emptiness of the boat, the fact that there was no sign of the person who had been in it, it just didn't sit right with me. I carefully rowed up beside it and tried to look inside. The boat didn't have much to offer in terms of clues, no personal belongings, no bags or jackets. But there was something else that caught my attention. A small, crumpled piece of paper in the bottom of the boat. I reached for it, my fingers trembling as I picked it up. It was a torn piece of a map. Just a small section, but I could make out enough to tell that it was a map of the lake, the same lake we were on. I stared at it, trying to make sense of it. There were markings on the map, places circled in red, some scribbled writing in the margins that didn't make sense. It looked like someone had been marking off certain areas, but I couldn't tell why. The map didn't seem to belong to anyone we knew, and there was no name, no phone number. "We need to go," my girlfriend said, her voice shaking now. I could see the fear in her eyes. She wasn't wrong. There was no reason to stay. Whatever had happened here, whatever blood had spilled in that boat, we shouldn't be part of it. I felt a wave of guilt and fear, guilt for not turning away sooner, for not trusting my instincts. I nodded and turned the boat around. I didn't need to be told twice. I rowed quickly, almost too quickly, as the dread in my chest began to grow. I kept my eyes on the shore, trying to focus on getting back safely. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching us, that someone had left that boat there for a reason. When we finally reached the shore, I hurriedly tied the boat to the dock. My hands were still shaking. We walked away as fast as we could, not looking back. But I couldn't forget what we had seen. The blood, the map, the empty boat. Something had happened here, something I didn't want to know about, and I wasn't sure if we had stumbled across something dangerous, or if we were just part of something much worse. The drive back home was silent, both of us lost in our own thoughts. We didn't speak until we were safely inside our apartment. And even then, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I've been thinking about that boat a lot since then. The blood still haunts me. I keep wondering if it was just an accident or if something darker was going on. I wish I could forget, but I can't. And sometimes, when I'm near a body of water or I hear the sound of a boat engine in the distance, I wonder if we were the next targets. I don't know how to explain this. I still feel uneasy, even though it's been weeks since it happened. Maybe writing it down will help me make sense of it. Or maybe I'm just hoping someone can tell me what I should have done differently. I live alone in a small apartment on the edge of the city. I'm not one to cook much, so I usually order delivery for dinner. There's a restaurant nearby that I like, and I've been using the same delivery service for months. Everything was fine, just part of my routine. But then, one night, something happened that I still can't get over. It was a Tuesday. I remember that clearly. I had spent the evening working from home, and by the time I was ready for dinner, I was tired and didn't feel like doing anything complicated. So, I ordered from my usual place. It wasn't a big deal. I'd done it hundreds of times before. I even noticed it was the same delivery driver who brought my food the last time. His name was Steve, at least that's what it said on the app. I didn't think anything of it. When the doorbell rang about 30 minutes later, I went to get the food. I wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary, but when I opened the door, Steve was standing there a little too close to me. I stepped back instinctively, just a step, but it felt like he didn't notice. He had a smile, but it didn't quite seem to reach his eyes. He handed me the food and said, "Enjoy your meal, have a nice night." I took the food, trying not to show that his presence was making me uncomfortable. It wasn't like he was doing anything wrong, but there was just something off. I didn't want to be rude, so I thanked him and closed the door. But then, something strange happened. Later that night, I noticed a text on my phone. It was from an unknown number. I didn't recognize it, but when I opened the message, it was just a single line, "Hope you enjoyed the food." I was confused. It didn't make any sense. How did this person know I'd ordered food? I checked the delivery receipt, and sure enough, it was from Steve. But I didn't remember giving him my phone number. I didn't know how to react, so I ignored it. Maybe it was just a mistake, I thought. The next few days, I went back to my usual routine. I ordered food a couple more times, but I didn't see Steve again. I tried to shake off the feeling that something wasn't right, but every time I thought about that text, I felt uneasy. Maybe it was nothing. People do weird things sometimes. Then, it happened again. I was working from home, like usual, and I ordered lunch around noon. The doorbell rang, and I opened it expecting the delivery driver. It was Steve again. This time, when he handed me the food, he didn't leave immediately. He lingered. I stepped back a little, but not far enough to make him feel like I was uncomfortable. He said, "Hey, I was wondering if you might need anything else tonight." I didn't understand. "What do you mean?" "Well," he said, smiling, "if you're free, I could drop off something special for you later. Maybe dinner? Or dessert?" I don't know why, but I felt a chill run down my spine. I felt trapped in that small space, and I knew that I didn't want him coming back, but I didn't know how to tell him to go away without being rude. He stood there for a moment, like he was waiting for me to answer, but I just took the food and closed the door quickly. I don't know why I didn't report him right away. Maybe I thought I was overreacting. Maybe I didn't want to make a big deal out of something that could be harmless. But when I got back inside and put the food on the table, I felt like I couldn't breathe. The next day, I received another text. Same unknown number. "Was thinking about you today. Hope everything's going well." That was the moment I knew something was very wrong. I didn't recognize the number. I hadn't given my phone number to him, and I had never even given him any indication that I wanted any kind of friendship or communication. It felt like an intrusion. Like he was trying to insert himself into my life in ways that made me uncomfortable. I started paying more attention to him after that. Whenever I ordered food, I noticed he would sometimes show up again, even if I hadn't ordered from his restaurant. I tried to mix up my orders, hoping he wouldn't be the one delivering. But there he was, again and again. I didn't want to be paranoid, but it felt like I couldn't escape him. He was always there. Every time I opened the door, he seemed to be waiting just a little too long before leaving, like he was watching me. It started to feel like a game to him. He'd leave little messages in the delivery bag, things like, "I hope you're having a good day," or "We should grab coffee sometime." One night, I made a decision. I wasn't going to order from that restaurant anymore, and I wasn't going to let him invade my space anymore. I deleted the app, changed my phone number, and figured I'd be safe. But the next day, I woke up to another text. "I know what you did. You can't run away from me." That was the point when I finally called the police. I was terrified. I didn't feel safe in my own apartment. I couldn't go outside without thinking someone was watching me, waiting for the next time I'd open the door. The police said they'd look into it, but I wasn't sure they'd find anything. The delivery company, of course, had no record of anything strange happening, and Steve seemed to disappear after I called them. They assured me they'd take care of it, but I'm still on edge every time I open the door. It's been a couple weeks now since I made the report, and I haven't seen Steve again. but every now and then I get a strange feeling. A sense that someone's watching. Maybe it's just my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe I'm just paranoid. But I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there, waiting for the right moment. I don't know what his intentions were, but I do know I don't ever want to find out. I never thought something like this would happen to me. I was just a regular guy, doing my thing, working a 9 to 5, hanging out with friends, and living my life. But everything changed when I bought a new phone. It was a Saturday morning when I decided to upgrade. My old phone was starting to feel sluggish, and the screen was cracked beyond repair. I figured it would be a good time to invest in something newer, something with better features. After browsing online, I headed to the store, found a phone I liked, and made the purchase. Nothing out of the ordinary. I went back home, excited to set up my new device and start fresh. At first, everything seemed normal. I transferred all my contacts, set up my apps, and adjusted the settings just the way I liked. The phone was great, fast, and felt smooth. But then, little things started to feel off. It started with a weird comment from my sister. We were texting, and I mentioned something random. I can't even remember what it was. But she replied, "Oh, I remember you saying that last week." I stared at the message, confused. We hadn't spoken last week about anything like that. I asked her what she meant, and she seemed genuinely confused. "What do you mean?" "You told me this last week." I let it slide, thinking maybe I had just forgotten. But then, a few days later, my best friend Mike mentioned something similar. We were at the bar, and out of nowhere, he said, "Man, I'm glad you finally got that new phone. I remember you talking about it last month, but you took forever to decide on the right one." Again, I was confused. I had never mentioned anything about the phone before. Sure, I'd been thinking about it for a while, but I hadn't told anyone when I was going to buy it. I asked Mike how he knew, but he just gave me a weird look and laughed. "You don't remember? You told me while we were at Joe's last week." I couldn't stop thinking about it. How were they both so sure about things they didn't remember saying? But I convinced myself it was just my memory playing tricks on me. Maybe I had mentioned it casually, and it had slipped my mind. But then the behavior got worse. It was like everyone around me knew things they shouldn't have. My coworkers, my family, even random acquaintances seemed to know personal details about my life, things I never shared with anyone. It wasn't just the phone. It was like they had access to my thoughts, my movements. One evening, I was sitting at home watching TV when I got a message from my cousin, Kate. She said, "You should really stop leaving your blinds open at night." I could see everything from across the street the other day. I froze. What? I hadn't left the blinds open. I was sure of it. I didn't even know anyone could see into my apartment from across the street. It felt like someone had been watching me. The next day, I noticed a few of my friends mentioning things that only someone who had been watching me could know. Details that were too specific, too private. One of them brought up a private conversation I had had with my ex, a conversation I was sure had only taken place in my head. It was like a punch to the gut, realizing that I couldn't trust anyone around me. My family, my closest friends, what were they doing? How did they know these things? It was too much. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't focus at work. I felt paranoid all the time. Then, one night, I was lying in bed, my new phone on the nightstand beside me, when I saw a notification pop up. It was a message from my brother, telling me he'd be coming by in the morning. Nothing unusual. But then, I noticed something odd. When I checked my phone, the screen flickered, and a strange image flashed up for a split second, a picture of my bedroom, taken from the corner of the room, near the door. My stomach dropped. I was sure I hadn't taken that picture. My phone was on the nightstand next to me, and it was turned off. The photo was of my room, from a perspective that couldn't have been anyone but someone standing in the doorway. My heart pounded. It was like the phone had been watching me while I slept. I rushed to my phone, checked all the apps, all the settings. Everything seemed normal, but I kept getting more and more of these strange moments. My phone would suddenly flash an image of something I had never seen before, like a snapshot of the park I walked through earlier in the day or the coffee shop I visited on my lunch break. I was losing my mind. I had no idea what was happening. I thought about getting rid of the phone, but I wasn't sure where to turn. What if the damage had already been done? What if someone had been watching me for weeks? I was sure I hadn't agreed to anything like that. No app asked for permission to access my camera without me knowing. So, I did what anyone in my position would do. I took the phone to a repair shop. I needed answers, and I needed them fast. The technician who looked at the phone didn't seem too concerned at first. But when he opened the back of the phone, his face went pale. He didn't say much, just told me that he would need to keep the phone for a while to do a thorough check. A couple of hours later, he called me and told me to come in immediately. When I arrived, he handed me the phone, now wiped clean. He explained that someone had installed a hidden camera app that had been activated remotely. It was using my phone's camera to monitor me, to watch everything I did. And it wasn't just the camera. The app had been tracking my location, recording conversations, and sending everything to an unknown server. I was furious. I didn't know who would do this, why they would do this to me. But it wasn't just the tech that scared me. The scariest part was realizing that it wasn't a mistake. Someone, somewhere, had been actively watching me through that phone. I don't know how long it had been happening. I don't know if it was my friends, my family, or someone else entirely. But I did know one thing for sure: I wasn't safe anymore. I ended up reporting it to the police, but they didn't have much to go on. The app was well hidden, and whoever was behind it seemed to know how to cover their tracks. I'm still left with the same terrifying question: who's been watching me? And why? It all started a few months ago, when I noticed something small, but unsettling. It wasn't obvious at first, but it stuck with me. I had gotten a strange email from what appeared to be my bank, asking me to verify some information. It seemed legitimate at the time, but looking back now, I should have known something was wrong. I clicked on the link, entered my details, and thought nothing of it. Over the next couple of weeks, more strange things happened. My credit card was declined, even though I knew I had enough funds. My debit account showed a couple of mysterious charges, small amounts that I didn't recognize. I called the bank, and they said someone had attempted to make a large withdrawal from my savings account, but they had blocked it. They recommended I change all my passwords and put a freeze on my accounts. So I did. It seemed like a hassle, but I thought it was just some sort of mistake. A few days later, I received an email that I initially ignored. It was from a company I'd never heard of, saying I had an order for an expensive phone, which was being shipped to a completely different address. I was confused, but I just assumed it was some kind of mix-up. I went to check my bank account again, and sure enough, there was a hefty charge for the phone. I called the company, but they told me the order had been confirmed with my details, and they were already processing it. That's when things started getting worse. A few days after that, I noticed more weird things happening. I received a package at my door, which was addressed to me, but it contained a bunch of designer clothes and accessories I didn't recognize. I called the company, and they told me the order was placed under my name and my billing information. I was horrified. Someone had been using my details to buy things, expensive things, and I had no idea how they were doing it. But it was clear now someone was pretending to be me. At first, I thought it was just some kind of identity theft, maybe a hacker who'd gotten a hold of my information. But when the police got involved, they started uncovering more details that were far more disturbing. They found that the person using my information was incredibly thorough. Whoever it was knew everything about me. They knew where I worked, my family's names, my childhood dog's name, things I had never even posted online. The worst part? They'd somehow gained access to my social media accounts and had been posting as me. That's how they convinced so many companies to give them what they wanted. They'd pretend to be me on the phone or send emails, and no one questioned it. The police didn't have much to go on. There was no clear evidence of how this person had gotten my information, but they seemed to be moving through my life, piece by piece. The most terrifying part came when I realized they had already started committing crimes in my name. One day, I received a call from my workplace. The voice on the other end was shaky, asking if I was okay. I didn't understand. It was a normal day, and I was sitting at my desk, just like any other day. They told me that a security footage review from the previous day had shown someone who looked just like me leaving the building carrying a large bag. But I had been at work all day, so how could that be? That's when everything started to unravel. The police told me that someone had been using my identity to rob a few businesses in the area, and it seemed like they were framing me for the crimes. It wasn't just about stealing things. They were going to set me up. They had been impersonating me perfectly, showing up at places I frequented, walking through the same doors I had been seen at. They even started using my name to run up fake charges, opening credit accounts under my identity. I couldn't believe it. How was this person so good at impersonating me? They knew things no one should have known, things about my habits, my friends, my past. I felt like I was losing control of my life. Things escalated quickly. There were accusations flying left and right. People at work started to look at me suspiciously, like they thought I was hiding something. I even had one of my close friends tell me she had seen my other self out at a bar, acting completely different from how I usually did. The police had found footage of someone wearing my clothes, walking around, buying stuff with my cards, even using my phone to send messages to people I knew. And it was starting to look like this person was trying to destroy me. It felt like they wanted to erase me from my own life. I couldn't stand the feeling of being watched. I started getting anonymous messages, taunting me. One of them was a picture of my childhood home, with a caption that read, "Remember when you used to live here?" It made my stomach turn. I couldn't escape them. They were everywhere. The tipping point came when I found out that this person had started using my name to buy illegal substances and even run scams. The police got a search warrant for my apartment, suspecting me of involvement in some kind of criminal activity. They thought it was me. I was terrified. I was innocent, but all the evidence pointed directly at me. In the middle of all this, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I couldn't sit around waiting for the police to catch this person, especially with everything piling up against me. I took a few days off work, rented a hotel room, and started trying to track down whoever had been using my identity. I even started digging through old emails and messages, trying to find some clue, anything that could lead me to them. That's when I stumbled upon something that made my blood run cold. I found an email that had been sent to my account from my own personal email address, sent about a week before all this started. It was a confirmation of some kind of transaction, but it wasn't from me. The subject line simply said, "You've been chosen." I don't know who this person was, or what they wanted from me. But after I found that email, everything started to click. They had been following me for months, gathering details, planning everything out. It wasn't just a random act of theft. This was calculated. They had set me up, planned everything so carefully, and had even started using my identity to destroy my life. They knew me better than I knew myself. I gave the email to the police, and they were able to trace it back to a person who had been using stolen identities to fund a massive criminal network. It took a lot of time, but they eventually caught the person who had been impersonating me. The worst part is that I'll never know how they did it. How did they get so much information about me? How did they know things I had never shared with anyone? I still don't have the answers, but I do know that I'll never be the same. That person was in my life, controlling it from the shadows for so long. And for a while, I thought I was going to lose everything. I'm still here, and it's over, but the fear hasn't gone away. It's like part of me is always waiting for the next time they'll come back. I never thought I'd end up in an emergency room. I mean, sure, we all have those moments when something goes wrong, maybe a bad fall, or a cut that needs stitches. But I wasn't prepared for the nightmare that unfolded the night I found myself there. It started like any other evening. I was feeling a little sick, but I thought it was just a cold. I didn't think much of it when I woke up in the middle of the night with a sharp pain in my side, but after a few hours, it got worse. I knew I needed to get checked out. So, I called a cab and headed to the nearest hospital. It was a typical night in the emergency room, overcrowded and chaotic. People were coughing, crying, talking on the phone, all while medical staff rushed from one patient to the next. It was loud, uncomfortable, and stressful. But I figured that's how it usually was at this time of night. I didn't have to wait long before a nurse took me back to a triage area. She was friendly, asked me a few questions about my symptoms, and then told me to sit tight until a doctor could see me. I was tired, sick, and honestly, just wanted to get it over with. I wasn't prepared for what happened next. A few minutes later, a doctor came in. He wasn't particularly old, maybe in his late 30s, early 40s. He had dark hair that was combed neatly back and a face that seemed a little too serious. His name tag said Dr. Curtis. He didn't greet me with a smile, just jumped right into asking me questions about my symptoms. At first, he seemed normal enough, just doing his job. But there was something off about him that I couldn't place. It was in his eyes, too focused, too intense. And the way he asked questions. He kept making notes as if he was writing down more than just my symptoms. It almost felt like he was studying me. After asking me about my pain, he checked my vitals and then started talking to me about my history. He asked how I'd been feeling over the past week, whether I had been under any stress, whether I had any family history of health problems. All pretty standard, but it was the way he asked that made me uneasy. There was this coldness to his voice, as though he was detaching himself from the humanity of the situation. I wasn't just a patient. I was some kind of puzzle to him. He kept circling around me, walking around the small exam room as he wrote things down. Then, he said something that made my stomach drop. "You know," he said, almost casually, "it's always interesting to see how people react to pain. Some people fight it, some give in immediately. It tells you a lot about them. I wasn't sure what to say. I just kind of shrugged it off. Maybe he was trying to make small talk, or maybe it was just a weird way of saying something medical. But the more he spoke, the more it felt wrong. He started asking questions that were a little too personal, things about my relationships, my childhood. I felt like I was being dissected, like he was trying to peel away layers of my life for some reason I couldn't understand. It was so invasive, and I didn't know how to get him to stop. Then, things took a darker turn. I started to feel dizzy and lightheaded, probably from the stress and the illness. I tried to focus, but my vision blurred for a second. When I looked up, Dr. Curtis was standing right next to me, staring at me with an odd, almost predatory look in his eyes. I froze. I didn't know what to do. He was standing too close. I could smell the faint scent of antiseptic on his skin, but there was something more, something about the way he was looking at me. I couldn't put my finger on it. You know, he said slowly, there's something about people who come in here looking like you. They have this air about them. It's like they're already giving up. It's fascinating. I could feel my pulse quickening. I didn't like where this was going. The room suddenly felt smaller, and the air felt thick. I started shifting uncomfortably in my chair, but he didn't move. He just stood there, watching me. It felt like I was trapped. He leaned in a little closer. "What do you think is going to happen next?" he asked, as if he already knew the answer. It wasn't a medical question. It was something else. My heart started racing. My mind was screaming at me to get up and leave, but my body wouldn't respond. I was paralyzed by the tension in the room. Before I could even come up with a response, another nurse entered. She was a woman with blonde hair, and she seemed surprised to find the doctor so close to me. She quickly walked over, a polite but worried expression on her face. She asked if everything was okay, and I almost felt like I was being rescued. Dr. Curtis straightened up and gave her a stiff smile. "Just making sure everything is in order," he said, his tone abruptly returning to professional. But it didn't feel professional. It felt forced. The nurse seemed to notice the shift in the air too. She turned to me and asked if I felt okay to move to another room for further tests. I nodded quickly, practically jumping up from the chair. I didn't care what the tests were at that point, I just needed to get away from him. As I walked out of the room, I could feel Dr. Curtis' eyes on me. I tried to keep my composure, but my hands were shaking. I wanted to run, but I didn't. I couldn't let him see that I was scared. The nurse led me down a hallway, and I kept my head down, refusing to look back. In the next room, things seemed a little better. I was surrounded by other medical staff, and I tried to focus on the task at hand. But the unease stayed with me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong, that Dr. Curtis had been watching me for reasons I didn't understand. Hours later, when I was finally discharged, I was more than ready to leave the hospital. I was exhausted, both physically and mentally, but as I walked out of the ER, I saw Dr. Curtis again. He was standing by the door, talking to another staff member. As soon as he saw me, he gave me a strange smile, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. It wasn't friendly. It was something else. And that look, that sickening smile, stayed with me as I left the hospital, unsure if I'd ever be able to shake the feeling that I was being watched. I don't know what his intentions were, or why he acted the way he did. But I'll never forget the way he made me feel, like I was the next thing on his list, something to dissect and study. I don't know how far he would have gone if that nurse hadn't walked in, but I can't bring myself to ever go back to that hospital.